Is it possible to commit the perfect crime? A house fire in Oregon came awfully close, until a microscopic clue on a piece of pipe told investigators what really happened. There's usually only one reason why people move to Gales Creek, Oregon.
Even though you're very close to Portland, you're within probably half an hour of Portland, you're out in the woods away from everybody. It's less populated. It's a chance to get away.
For Derek and Roxanne Doran, Gales Creek provided a much-needed refuge from their stressful careers in the computer industry.
When they bought that property in Gales Creek, that was more than my sister would have ever have dreamed of having. That was her dream come true.
And it also gave them enough room for Roxanne's horse farm.
She loved her horses. They were her balance in life, and she loved showing them. She loved spending time with them. That was her downtime and her stress relief, I'm sure.
After living there for several years, the Durans started construction on a 1,500-square-foot addition, but they would never see it completed. Late one Sunday afternoon, neighbors saw a plume of smoke rising from the property.
The fire was actually reported by folks that lived more than a quarter-mile away. The house was not visible to any of the neighbors.
It took the volunteer fire department about 20 minutes to get there.
When we come up to a fire and it's fully involved, that means that we visually can see flames coming out of every opening, door, window. That usually means that it's been a period of time before we've gotten there.
Derek Duran returned home from grocery shopping, and when he saw Roxanne's car, he feared the worst.
Derek ran up towards the fire and dropped to his knees and screamed that he believed that his wife was inside.
Well, that's the worst thing that you can possibly hear is that someone's inside. You still have the sense that you want to try to get in there and possibly see if they're alive.
It took almost 3 hours to bring the fire under control. When they did, they found Roxanne's charred remains.
The body had been burnt horrifically.
Her remains were little more than 35 pounds. They were so limited that the medical examiner was unable to determine the cause of death.
Since dental records were useless in making a positive identification, the medical examiner used DNA.
So what we did was take bone marrow material, submit it to the laboratory. They got some samples from the parents and proved her identity by DNA.
Roxanne Duran was only 34 years old.
From that moment on, you have a loss and you're frightened and you're scared. But it just seemed from there, it went into a bad dream that just turned into a nightmare.
And that nightmare got worse when pieces of a handgun were discovered next to Roxanne's body. Fire investigators wanted to know what started the fire that killed Roxanne Duran. Roxanne's husband, Derek, had a possible explanation.
Derek said it had been a normal Sunday. They had awakened kind of late, and he had made breakfast for his wife. And it was just a lazy sort of day, but there were frozen pipes because of the weather.
To thaw the pipes, Derek said he turned on the clothes dryer in the basement and left its door open to heat the room, then left to buy groceries. The dryer, however, used propane gas.
Propane is pretty dangerous like that. It lays down in the low areas and get a lot of people get hurt from that.
As a matter of routine, police asked Derek for the store receipt to prove he was shopping, and he willingly complied.
There was a receipt that showed that he, in fact, had been at the store on the day in question.
But police were troubled by the scratch marks Derek had on his face.
His explanation was that he was clearing debris that had fallen during the ice storm across the road that led up to his residence. The explanation is in moving these branches that he scratched himself across the face.
The highly flammable propane gas clothes dryer was one possible cause of the fire. Another possibility focused on the garage, where investigators found that the battery cable in Roxanne's car was disconnected.
The car was brought up as a possible origin of the fire, that somehow a battery cable had caused a spark.
And the house was being remodeled. Only the wall frames were up, which meant the fire could spread easily.
Forensic experts retained by the state to examine the vehicle found no indication that would suggest to them that there was any type of arcing that caused this fire to occur or start in the vehicle and then spread into the house.
But investigators thought the laundry room was the most likely source. And they found something unusual. Small pellet-like material near the clothes dryer.
And it all seemed to be in a small little pile right near the origin of the fire.
At first, no one knew what this was or why it would be there.
I thought about this for about 3 days, and we had a cat at the time, and it wasn't until I had to change the kitty litter that I determined, hey, that's a type of kitty litter.
The Durans had cats, but their cat litter box was nowhere near the laundry room. Detective McKinney kept asking himself, why would cat litter be near the origin of the fire?
I went out and bought a bag of it and brought it back to my office and actually had it sitting in my cubicle and trying to figure out why that would be there.
As he pondered this, a fellow detective took notice of the cat litter in McKinney's office.
He walked by and asked me if I was going to start a fire. That detective worked burglary cases and really didn't know what kind of a case I was involved in. And I said, why would you ask me that?
The detective, a former Boy Scout, said, soaking cat litter with gasoline was an old trick to help start campfires.
It was in an old Boy's Life magazine that he had learned about it.
A background check revealed Derek Duran was an Eagle Scout in his youth and might have known about this method of starting fires. But investigators found no clear evidence of arson. Arson dogs did not detect the presence of accelerants anywhere in the house, including in the burned cat litter. In terms of possible foul play, Derek and Roxanne had no known enemies and by all accounts had a happy marriage. But the Durans owned a handgun, which was found near Roxanne's body. Police had to consider if this could have been suicide or murder. The handgun found next to Roxanne Duran's charred remains raised new questions about her death. The medical examiner x-rayed the remains, but the body was so badly burned, it was impossible to find evidence of a gunshot wound. There was no ash or soot in Roxanne's lungs, and no carbon monoxide in her blood, which meant she was not breathing when the fire started.
This to me is a homicide. There's no other reasonable explanation as for why a healthy young woman is dead before a fire starts.
And there was blood in Roxanne's airway.
She had obviously died by some sort of violent means because she had aspirated blood. And from my past experience, people that aspirate blood means that there was some sort of horrific injury to their face or head, and their last breaths are taking in blood rather than air.
Roxanne Duran did not die in the fire, which means somebody caused her death.
But how had the fire started? Investigators turned to the propane-powered clothes dryer. Derek Duran said he thought the dryer started the fire because when he left the house, the dryer was running. But investigators discovered that the propane gas line into the dryer was disconnected. Had firefighters done this while extinguishing the blaze?
Firefighters are not concerned about destroying evidence. They're there to put the fire out and to save human life.
Since the disconnected hose had a threaded metal end, a forensic metallurgist found no evidence that firemen created the disconnection.
Because if the threads, once they lock in order for them to thread, they'd have to strip it to pull out. These threads did not show that characteristic.
Using a metallurgical microscope known as a metallograph, Bruce Wong saw evidence of oxidation on the threads.
What I see there tells me that this pipe was open at the time of the fire, that's sufficiently open at the time of fire so that the deposit could occur.
Also on the pipe, Mr. Wong saw tiny brass beads sitting on top of the oxide on the threads of the metal fitting. This formed when the brass fixture melted and fell through the air, forming these tiny beads before landing on the fitting. This was further proof that the fitting was disconnected during the fire.
It indicated that the connection was open, which would indicate that the fire was deliberately set.
Derek told me that the dryer was running, and it couldn't have been running because it was not connected at the time. And that was a provable lie.
Fire investigators now made their official determination. The fire at the Duran house was arson.
And all of a sudden, everything starts making sense. And you fall into that area that you can actually follow what happens then. It makes sense, and you can forensically prove that.
But what was the motive? Roxanne's family revealed the couple argued about money, particularly the money Roxanne was spending on her horses.
They had a horse barn built, a riding arena. She was taking what's called cutting lessons for, I believe they would cost $300 per lesson.
Investigators also learned that Derek's job was going to be transferred 150 miles away. That would mean selling their dream home and relocating, something Roxanne did not want to do.
I think that Roxanne said to him, Derek, you go rent an apartment or we'll buy you someplace up there and then you come back on weekends. I don't think my sister wanted to move. I think that she voiced that probably pretty clearly to him, and I don't think he liked it.
Investigators say Roxanne's defiance was too much for Derek. It was at variance with his vision of a perfect life and a perfect marriage.
In talking to friends, coworkers, everyone that I could possibly talk with, I could not establish a specific motive. I had my suspicions that it was probably because Roxanne was beginning to stand up for herself. According to her friends, she was starting to become more independent, which Derek would not like.
Derek wasn't going to get his way, and he was going to do whatever he had to do to get his way. And there was nobody that was going to stand in his way, and that included his wife.
When questioned by police, Derek denied setting the fire and claimed he would never have harmed his wife. With this tiny spot on his jeans prove otherwise? The medical examiner ruled Roxanne Duran's manner of death as homicide, since she was dead before the fire started. What he didn't know, however, was the cause of death. But the fatal fire was determined to be arson, and Roxanne's husband, Derek, became a potential murder suspect. On the jeans he was wearing the day of the fire, investigators noticed a small spot.
I asked him specifically if it was blood, and he told me no, it was mud.
A phenolphthalein test proved Derek wrong. The spot was blood, and a subsequent DNA test proved it was Roxanne's blood. For police, this made perfect sense. They never believed Derek's explanation for the scratches on his face.
I know what the scratches from brush would look like, and this was not a scratch from brush mark. This appeared more to be fingernail scratches.
Derek Duran had lied about how this fire occurred, how the scratches on his face occurred, how the blood on his pants came to be there.
With proof of arson, his wife's blood on his clothing, and the apparent fingernail scratches on his face, Derek Duran was arrested and charged with arson and murder. But Derek was convinced he'd never spend a day in jail.
Derek Duran thought he was smarter than everyone else. He was sending emails to friends of his, coworkers at Intel, updating them on the trial as it was going along, talking about it in terms of being a chess match, and his view of how that chess game was going, and his expectation that he would be acquitted.
Prosecutors believe Derek and Roxanne got into an argument on the afternoon of her death, an argument that turned violent.
I'd rather get rid of you first.
Blows were struck with enough force for Roxanne's blood to land on Derek's jeans. She tried to defend herself and scratched his face. Prosecutors believe he killed her, although they're not sure exactly how. Realizing he needed to cover up the crime, he decided to burn down the house. First, he went outside and turned off the propane gas, then disconnected the supply line to the dryer, and set fire to the gas-soaked kitty litter. When he went back outside to open the propane valve, the gas would have produced a blowtorch effect, burning hotter than natural gas and immediately igniting the materials surrounding it. Prosecutors believe that Derek went shopping to establish an alibi, but not all of his time was accounted for.
There was a discrepancy in Derek Duran's timeline with respect to the receipts that he obtained at the various stores. He could account for about an hour to an hour and a half of his time, and it would appear that he would have had to have been gone well in excess of 2 hours based upon his initial comments of when he left and when he returned.
Since the fire almost completely consumed Roxanne's body, no one knows exactly how she died.
The jury was unable to make a determination on the charge of murder, unable to decide. They did not find Mr. Duran not guilty of murder. They simply said, we are unable to come to a decision.
As a result, Derek was only convicted of arson and first-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
Manslaughter in first degree is defined under Oregon law as recklessly causing the death of another human being under circumstances manifesting extreme indifference to the value of human life.
Did Derek think he could get away with this? Absolutely. Absolutely. Derek thought that he could be smarter than all of them. His ego was that big, and those people were beneath him.
Investigators say this case proves that no matter what someone does to cover his tracks, something always remains behind.
People do think when they start a fire that it's going to burn up everything and destroy all the evidence that they did it. And that's a fallacy that we like people to believe, because we can go back in as investigators and pretty well find out what caused the fire.
The fire in this case was so severe that it destroyed a lot of the type of evidence that you might normally find at a homicide scene. However, the fire itself creates evidence. And in this particular case, the fire itself and how it started and where it started became crucial evidence in the prosecution.
They always get caught in the end. Sometimes it takes a while, but they get caught.
This case was based almost exclusively on forensics, even though I like to think that I have something to do with it. But in actuality, in this case, it was forensics that found him guilty.
A millionaire and his family were executed in their own home. And for 3 years, the murders went unsolved until a 30-year-old box of bullets and some iridescent fibers revealed the ultimate betrayal. The beach house at Pajaro Dunes in Northern California. On weekends and holidays, it was the perfect getaway for the Ewell family. The family patriarch Dale was an extremely wealthy man who made his fortune selling airplanes.
He was quite successful because he's very outgoing, very personable, convincing, and he'd go out on these ranches and sell farmers these airplanes, land in their field, sell them planes, and then teach them how to fly.
Dale and his wife, Glee, had been happily married for 31 years. Their 24-year-old daughter, Tiffany, was a graduate student in accounting.
Tiffany, very sweet girl by all accounts. She seemed to do well in school, and everybody loved her.
Their 21-year-old son, Dana, was a business major at Santa Clara University.
Dana was a very precocious child, very smart, almost too intelligent. I heard that once upon a time his IQ was 165, which is extremely high.
In 1992, after spending the Easter holiday at Pajaro Dunes, Dale, Glee, and their daughter Tiffany returned home to Fresno. 2 days later, the Ewell's housekeeper tried to enter the home and sensed trouble. The security alarm was turned off, yet the doors were locked. Inside, she found Dale, Glee, and Tiffany dead from gunshot wounds.
The thing that I recall most about the Ewell home from the murders is the photograph of Glee Ewell laying on her back in the den. She had a look of fright on her face, even in death.
I've never seen a house that severely ransacked by any burglar I've ever dealt with. And I worked burglary before I worked homicide.
Jewelry was missing from the home, and Dale Ewell's wallet was empty. But there were no signs of forced entry.
How did somebody get in here, turn off the alarm, because it didn't ring at the alarm company or the police department?
All three were shot with a 9mm weapon while bringing their luggage in from the beach house on Sunday night.
So those tragic things, your life is great 1 second, and a millisecond later, you're gone.
Dana Ewell was fortunate. He avoided the ambush since he was having dinner with his girlfriend and her family that night, 160 miles away.
He began dating Monica Zent, an FBI agent's daughter. At the time of the murders, Dana Ewell was with the family, and his alibi was FBI agent John Zent.
Investigators found an open box of 9mm ammunition in the master bedroom, and they also found very unusual fibers on the victims.
And I had some fluorescent fibers that glowed under the ultraviolet light in the dark, and some rubbery stuff that I didn't have a clue as to what it was, except it appeared to be rubber.
In their search for suspects, investigators thought that a business associate or rival may have wanted Dale Ewell dead. Before Dale acquired his business, the company was allegedly involved in some criminal activity.
He took over the dealership from the former owner, who had gotten into a little bit of legal difficulty with marijuana smuggling.
Or Glee Ewell might have been the target.
Glee Ewell had worked for the CIA at one time. The CIA doesn't tell you a whole lot, but they did acknowledge the fact she did work for him.
With talk of marijuana smuggling and CIA connections, investigators knew these murders would be difficult to solve. The cold-blooded murder of millionaire Dale Ewell, his wife Glee, and daughter Tiffany was big news in Fresno, California.
Fresno's had some big homicide cases over the years, but I would venture to say this is probably one of the biggest ones of the century.
Investigators suspected that the Ewells were killed on Sunday night when they returned from the beach house. Glee and Tiffany Ewell drove back separately and were killed first.
Tiffany? Tiffany?
Dale Ewell got home about a half hour later.
Whomever had killed his wife and daughter remained in the house for perhaps another half hour. Why would this killer or killers, why would they remain in the home for a half hour or so after they had gunned down two people?
But that's apparently what happened. Dale was shot in the back of his head as he entered the house.
Just stunned, I just became numb. Just could not understand or believe or contemplate such a thing.
All three were killed with a 9mm weapon.
These people were essentially ambushed. It was a scene of pure evil. I don't think there's any other way to explain it. You can't try to say, oh, well, these people are insane or the perpetrator's insane or anything like that. The perpetrator in this case was just purely evil.
The Ewell's son Dana had an airtight alibi, as did everyone who had keys to the house. Investigators found an open box of 9mm ammunition in the Ewell's bedroom. Was this the ammunition used by the killer? The 9mm bullets retrieved from the bodies had been damaged on impact, but the back end of each bullet, known as the heel, was intact.
The impressions on there had nothing to do with their bullets being fired. It was something that occurred during manufacture and was something that I hadn't seen before.
So Alan Boudreau removed the casing from an unfired bullet and compared it to the heels of the bullets from the victims. The tool marks were the same.
These bullets, the murder bullets, came from this box of ammunition.
An identification number on the box indicated the bullets were made in 1971. And a price sticker on the box revealed it was purchased at a local hardware store. When police called the hardware store, the owner said he still had all his sales receipts, even the ones from 30 years ago.
And they found the receipt for that ammunition made out to Dale Ewell.
Proof that Dale Ewell and his family were killed with his own ammunition.
It had to be somebody that knew enough about that family to know that there was a box of 9mm ammo in Dad's bedroom, which meant it was an inside job of some sort.
And the bullets looked like they had been fired through more than just the barrel of a gun.
These bullets went through something that marked them, unlike any normal gun barrel. And it could be a flash suppressor, sound suppressor, silencer, something along that line.
What robber would come to a crime scene with a silencer on a gun?
Could it have been a hitman? Evidence gathered at the Ewell family home painted a bizarre picture of how Dale Ewell, his wife, and 24-year-old daughter were killed. Someone with a house key turned off the security alarm and murdered them with a 9mm weapon using ammunition belonging to the victim, Dale Ewell. It looked like a botched robbery. Some money and jewelry were missing, and the only forensic evidence was the bullets and the yellow luminescent fibers.
From the scientific end of the investigation, what I had to work with was relatively little.
The only remaining family member, the Ewell's 21-year-old son, Dana, had a rock-solid alibi. He was with his girlfriend and her family.
There really was never any question about his alibi where he was on Easter Sunday when his parents were being killed.
What innocent guy gets an attorney and wants us to contact the attorney to contact him just to get information on their parents or their sister? That made no sense.
Dana Ewell also had a clear motive. He was the beneficiary of his parents' estate.
Dana Ewell stood to inherit approximately $8 million. It would have been approximately $4 million had his sister not also been murdered.
Dana was a prim and proper type kid, went to class with his $200 shirt and his $100 tie that he let everybody know that's what it cost.
He also made some unusual inquiries after the murders.
Dana Ewell called me at the coroner's office and interrogated me as to the progress of the autopsy, what we'd found, and so forth.
It is really unusual for some close family member to call and ask for the details of the case in the way he did.
And investigators learned that Dana had some character flaws. Apparently, he had plagiarized a term paper in his business ethics class and failed the course. Investigators also learned that Dana was a loner. His only friend was his former college roommate, Joel Radovsich, so they decided to give him a call.
First thing Joel said upon being phoned by Detective Souza was, "Are you going to arrest me?" It was an unusual thing to say.
So unusual that police put him under surveillance and found that he didn't use the telephone in his apartment. Instead, he'd use a payphone nearby.
They had two payphones mounted on the outside exterior wall of the 7-Eleven store. He would look down at his waist level and then dial a number. We deducted the fact that he was looking at a pager.
An undercover officer positioned himself within earshot.
I don't want no f***ing stock options. I want $250,000, and I want it now.
Radovsich demanded $250,000 and also wanted advice on how to invest it.
Joel was a world of his own. Like no one was around him. Only thing they were talking about was their investments and where they were going to invest the money.
According to phone records, Joel was talking to Dana Ewell. A check of Joel's financial records indicated that he was spending freely, despite not having a job.
He was taking helicopter flight lessons at the Long Beach airport, some of which cost $500 an hour. No job, no source of income, and he's spending this kind of money.
They found that the checks for some $5,600 odd for Joel's lessons had been paid by Dana directly. This was a very curious event. This was something that led directly to a financial link between the two suspects.
And Joel Radovsich purchased several very suspicious items prior to the murders.
During a surveil of Joel Radovsich, the detectives found that Joel had ordered books from a publisher in Boulder, Colorado. And in turn, he had these books shipped to a man named Jack Ponce.
One of those books described how to make a homemade silencer. A background check revealed Jack Ponce was a 23-year-old law student and Joel Radovsich's lifelong friend. Records indicated that Ponce owned a 9mm semi-automatic weapon.
Jack Ponce said initially that the weapon had been purchased for the purpose of shooting possums in his attic. Investigators found the whole possum shooting scenario a bit hard to swallow.
During police questioning, Ponce denied any involvement in the Yule murders and said his 9mm gun had been stolen.
We've probably heard that story a few times in our career.
This murder investigation had been complicated and time-consuming. By this time, 3 years had passed, and Dana Yule told everyone who would listen that detectives John Souza and Chris Curtis were too inept to solve the case.
Dana Yule, he would call us Mutt and Jeff and Bert and Ernie, and we weren't smart enough to find the murderer of his family.
And, Ernie Burt couldn't find a gun in a gun store.
And the only reason we had a cop's job is because we couldn't get no other job.
I'll be damned if some kid like that's going to make fun of us.
Investigators now had 3 suspects in the murder of Dale, Clee, and Tiffany Yule. The Yule's son, Dana, his college roommate, Joel Radovich, and Joel's friend, Jack Ponce. With a search warrant, investigators found a number of interesting items in Joel Radovich's apartment, including a half-dozen tennis balls with holes drilled through them.
I found out that the dyes that they use in these yellow and orange and purple, pink tennis balls are FDA-approved dyes because children and dogs chew on tennis balls. And it was very interesting, but I found out everything there is to know about tennis balls.
The fibers from these tennis balls were consistent with those found on the murder victims. Proof that the tennis balls were part of the homemade silencer.
Jack Ponce was arrested at a restaurant where he worked as a bartender. Joel was eventually arrested at his favorite Taco Bell, where he seemed to eat 3 times a day, every day. Dana, however, was nowhere to be found.
Radovich admitted to nothing. Jack Ponce, however, didn't want to face the death penalty, so he decided to cooperate.
He was the one of the 3 who, as the police say, rolled over. He agreed to turn evidence against Joel Radovich and Dana Yule, tell them everything he knew.
Ponce originally told investigators that his 9mm weapon had been stolen. He now admitted he sold it to Joel Radovich for $500. A few days later, Ponce said Joel returned the gun and told him to get rid of it.
Joel told Jack that he was the one that killed the Yule family, and he described the inside of the house, where he was, how he did, what happened, the sequence of events. And we knew all that, but it was never in the newspaper.
Ponce said he disassembled the gun, threw the parts in dumpsters, and buried the barrel in a vacant lot in Los Angeles. In an unbelievable stroke of luck, the barrel was still there.
Been there for 3 years. Surprisingly and luckily, we have an open lot in LA that stayed vacant and wasn't paved over or concreted over for 3 years.
Holes had been drilled into the gun's barrel, consistent with the information in the books that Joel Radovich ordered. Investigators dipped the barrel in a special solution to remove the mud and rust, then attached it to a rifle and test-fired it using the same ammunition found at the crime scene. Amazingly, after 3 years in the ground, the test was conclusive.
Lo and behold, these test-fired bullets looked very much like the Yule bullets in their general character and appearance.
That was the part that contained the forensic evidence we needed to establish that weapon was used in the murder.
For prosecutors, what happened was unthinkable, but perfectly logical. After all, the evidence showed it was an inside job all along. Dana Yule wanted his parents' money, and he did not want to wait for them to die of natural causes, and he did not want to share it with his sister either. So he hired his roommate, Joel Radovich, to kill them all. Radovich decided to use an assault rifle with a homemade silencer, reinforced with tennis balls to further reduce the noise. Dana gave Joel the house keys, the alarm code, and told him where his father kept the box of 9mm ammunition. To establish his alibi, Dana had dinner that night with his girlfriend and her father, who happened to be an FBI agent. When Glee and Tiffany came home, Radovich ambushed them. He shot Tiffany first. Then he followed Glee into another room and shot her. About a half hour later, Dale came home, and Joel was waiting. Tennis ball fibers left at the scene were consistent with the fibers found in Radovich's home. Prosecutors believe that Glee Yule knew who was responsible.
She had met Joel before. Of the three, she's the only one that got a look at Joel, and I believe knew that her son was killing her for the estate.
Jack Ponce was given immunity in exchange for his testimony. Dana Yule eventually turned himself in, and in 1995, he and Joel Radovich were both convicted of first-degree murder and murder for financial gain. Both are serving life in prison without parole.
I believe that the physical evidence in this case was a really big deal and probably carried the weight of the conviction.
He was an arrogant young man. He was an extremely arrogant young man that thought he was smarter. A very smart young man, don't get me wrong, but he thought he was smarter than a bunch of streetwise cops.
We weren't lax in our job. It just took a long time to put it together, to get enough evidence to go to court.
Before we get back to the episode, if you're listening on Spotify, please take a moment to tap 5 stars. It's one of the easiest ways to support Forensic Tales and helps the show reach new listeners. Thank you so much for being here. To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
From the very beginning of Forensic Tales, I have always said that every case, no matter how old or unsolved, deserves to be remembered. This week, we've reached an incredible milestone together, episode 300. For 300 episodes, we've explored the breakthroughs, the science, and the stories behind some of the world's most haunting crimes. And I can't think of a better case to mark this moment than one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in true crime history. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, a shadowy figure who terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s, leaving behind a trail of victims, taunting letters, and cryptic ciphers that still baffle investigators to this day. Despite decades of police work, suspects, and scientific advancements, the Zodiac's identity remains a mystery. For our 300th episode, we're going back to the beginning, revisiting the Zodiac's crimes, the evidence he left behind, and the forensic science that continues to pursue him. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 300, The Zodiac Killer. It's a case that's been described as arguably the most famous unsolved murder case in American history. There have been dozens of documentaries made about it, countless podcasts and YouTube episodes. It's become a fixture of pop culture and a focus by amateur detectives. The story has even inspired villains, including Scorpio in Dirty Harry, the Gemini Killer in Exorcist 3, John Doe in Seven, and the Riddler in the 2022 Batman movie. And while there is still so much we don't know about this case, there's a lot we do. Investigators agree there are 4 confirmed Zodiac attacks across the Bay Area of California between December 1968 and October 1969. 2 at suburban Lovers Lane, 1 daylight assault at Lake Berryessa, and a city homicide in San Francisco. 5 people were killed, and 2 survived to tell us what they saw. Although it's worth mentioning, the Zodiac himself would later claim in 1974 through his letters that he's killed at least 37, a claim the police haven't been able to verify. Lake Herman Road, December 20th, 1968, the Zodiac's first 2 confirmed victims. High school sweethearts, 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen and 17-year-old David Faraday, parked on Lake Herman Road, a spot known to locals as a lover's lane. They were just 2 high school kids who wanted some time together alone before heading back home to their parents' house. Sometime after 11 p.m., a second vehicle pulled alongside them. The driver of that second car fired into theirs. As David tried to exit, he was shot in the head with a .22. Betty Lou got out of the car and tried to run away, but was shot multiple times as she ran. Of the 6 total shots that were fired at her, only 1 of them missed. The entire thing happened within just 2 or 3 minutes, and when all was said and done in the police investigation, there was no solid forensic evidence, no usable footprints at the scene, no tire impressions of the shooter, nothing when it came to the forensics. It just looked like a senseless crime, a madman wanting to kill 2 innocent teenagers that night while sitting on Lover's Lane. An ambush that would only make sense in hindsight. Blue Rock Springs, shortly after midnight, July 4th and 5th, 1969, the Zodiac's next confirmed victims. 22-year-old Darlene Farron and 19-year-old Michael Mago were sitting in a parked car when a man approached the passenger side and opened fire with a 9mm. Darlene was killed, but Michael survived with serious injuries. He was able to give the police a description of Zodiac, a heavyset white man around 5'8", 195 to 200 pounds, with a large face and curly light brown hair. He wore dark clothes and wasn't wearing glasses. But with a description like that, half the men in the Bay Area might have been suspects. At around 12:40 a.m. after the shooting, a man called Vallejo police from a payphone near the station, calmly reporting a double murder and adding, "They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye." That call was the first clue that these 2 attacks were related. The 7 months between the Lake Herman Road and the Blue Rock Springs was the Zodiac's cooling off period. Some have speculated Darlene may have known her killer, but that's never been proven. Rumors started spreading after Robert Graysmith's 1986 book Zodiac, which cited interviews with some of her friends. Also because Michael reportedly gave conflicting reports, initially telling police he didn't recognize the shooter, but later claiming the man's name was Richard. Darlene's sister even said that she had once dated a man by that name. But once again, the idea that Darlene knew who the Zodiac was hasn't been proven. Right now, it's just one of the many possible theories tied to this case. Lake Berryessa, Napa County, September 27th, 1969. College students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were having a picnic when a man in a black hood marked with a crosshair symbol emerged, armed with a gun and pre-cut rope. He said he had just gotten out of jail and needed some money and their car to drive down to Mexico. After binding them, he stabbed both of them. Cecilia later died from 10 stab wounds, and Brian, who had been stabbed 6 times, somehow survived. But before leaving, the attacker drew the crosshair on Brian's car door and scrawled dates of the prior attacks with September 27, 69, 6:30 by knife. Earlier that day, multiple witnesses reported seeing a suspicious man at the lake that day, a dentist and his son, and later 3 women who even helped create a composite sketch. The man was described as about 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, consistent with survivor Brian Hartnell's later description. After the stabbing, the Zodiac then drove almost 30 miles from the lake to a car wash in downtown Napa. Then at 7:40 p.m., he called the Napa County Sheriff's Office to report the crime as well as confess. But oddly enough, he never hung up the phone. Just a few minutes after the call to the police was placed, a reporter arrived at the payphone where the phone was still hanging off the hook. From a forensic perspective, it was a win. Investigators were able to lift a wet palm print from the phone itself. Presidio Heights, San Francisco, October 11th, 1969, the last confirmed attack. Paul Stein, a cab driver and doctorate student, was shot in the head once during a fare to Presidio Heights. The Zodiac also took his car keys as well as his wallet. As it happened, 3 teenagers saw the entire thing from a house just a few feet away. They watched as the killer wiped the cab down and walked away. But due to a police clerical error, an incorrect suspect description was given to all the officers who were on patrol that night. They said the suspect was black. So when the officers encountered a white male near the crime scene who matched the teen's description of a husky white male in dark clothing, they let him go, thinking they were looking for an African American. This would soon become a detail that the Zodiac later taunted the authorities about in a letter. Days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received a bloody piece of Stein's shirt as proof. That same stretch of correspondence solidified the killer's brand. Letters beginning, "This is the Zodiac speaking," laced with threats, diagrams, and ciphers. He also threatened to shoot a tire on a school bus and kill children as they got off. On July 31st, 1969, 3 Bay Area newspapers each received nearly identical letters from someone claiming responsibility for the attack. They also enclosed parts of a 408-syllable cipher. And within days, a local couple cracked it, revealing Bose rather than a name. From there, the Zodiac's mailings continued, shifting from validation, shirt swatches, to theater, bomb diagrams, buttons, to puzzles, the 340 cipher solved decades later. The letters are what tied the crimes together in real time, and why no one can forget about this case even all of these years later. So that's what we know. 4 scenes, 2 survivors, and a voice on the phone, as well as some letters, leaving just enough physical forensic evidence for us to study and just enough mystery to haunt the case for decades. But could there be other Zodiac victims out there? Other suspected victims include Raymond Davis, a cab driver from Oceanside, California, who was found murdered in 1962, the 1963 beach murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards in Santa Barbara County, the 1964 shooting of honeymooners Johnny and Joyce Swindle in San Diego, and the 1966 killing of Sherry Joe Bates near Riverside City College. Later cases sometimes linked him to include the abduction of Kathleen Johns, the disappearance of nurse Donna Lass, and even the shooting of San Francisco Police Department officer Richard Radich. But even though these cases have undeniable similarities, like the use of a .22 caliber weapon, threats against buses, attacks on couples, or taunting letters, none of these cases have ever been conclusively proven to be the work of the Zodiac. When we look back at the Zodiac crimes, it's easy to imagine what investigators would do today: DNA testing, touch DNA on the bindings, genetic genealogy, and that's just to name a few. Today, investigators have so many forensic tools at their disposal. But back in 1968 and 1969, the reality of forensic science was much narrower. They had to work with the basics, traditional tools that could sometimes connect crimes, but rarely point to a specific suspect. And the first of those tools came into play almost immediately: ballistics. At both Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, detectives recovered shell casings and bullets. And from that discovery, they were able to determine that a .22 caliber weapon was used in the first attack and a 9mm semi-automatic pistol in the second. Later on, microscopic comparison confirmed that the same 9mm was used in multiple shootings. But that's as far as it went, linking crime scenes to one another, but not to a particular suspect. There was no national ballistics database like NIBIN, so investigators couldn't scan casings together against thousands of others. They had to compare them manually underneath a microscope, case by case. As you can imagine, that's a pretty tough job for even the most experienced forensic ballistic examiners. If ballistics helped link the crimes, investigators hoped fingerprints might identify the killer. But just like the bullets, the prints only took them so far. The most famous potential fingerprint came at Presidio Heights. When the killer wiped down Paul Stein's taxicab, he left behind what appeared to be a bloody latent print on the driver's side door. As you'd expect, the police lifted it, but in the 1960s, prints were compared by hand, just like the bullets. Examiners used magnifying glasses, overlay transparencies, and card files. A print could only be matched if a suspect was in custody or had been and took their prints in order to compare them directly. And with the Zodiac, there was no one to compare against, or at least no one investigators could prove. With no matches from fingerprints, detectives shifted their focus to the killer's most personal signature, the handwriting in his taunting letters. Because if there was one forensic discipline the Zodiac case leaned on, it was handwriting. Every time a letter arrived at a newspaper, experts were called in to examine the penmanship, slant, and the pressure of the writings. They did things like compare the Zodiac's blocky, deliberate writing to dozens of suspects, including the most infamous Arthur Lee Allen, someone we're going to talk about a little later in the episode. But handwriting analysis is inherently subjective. Two experts could look at the same exact sample and come to two very different conclusions about them. To this day, handwriting has never been accepted as a definitive proof in a courtroom. It could suggest, but it couldn't convict. More on his letters in just a moment. Trace and biological evidence. At Lake Berryessa, Brian Hartnell's Volkswagen had the Zodiac's signature crosshair symbol scrawled across the door in black marker. The bindings used on Brian and Cecilia were recovered, but in 1969, there was no way to test them for touch DNA or microscopic skin cells. And the payphone palm print lifted in Napa, that was yet another missed opportunity of the era. Police had a clear impression, but no database to run it through. So without a suspect in hand, the print went nowhere. I think that has to make you stop and wonder, If the Zodiac committed his crime today, in 2025, would he be able to get away with it? Could we have recovered touch or trace DNA at one of these crime scenes? Something that we never dreamed possible in the late 1960s. Or would it be some other type of forensic technique that we have today, but we didn't have back then? Would the Zodiac case be such a mystery if it happened in today's era? When we say the Zodiac case went cold, it wasn't for a lack of effort. It was because forensics simply hadn't caught up yet. Investigators had everything we talked about: bullets, prints, bindings, handwriting samples, even a swatch of the killer's clothing from Paul Stein's shirt. But they didn't have the science to wring out answers out of any of them. If the Zodiac's crimes were terrifying, then the letters were downright chilling. More than anything else, it was the written word that turned these murders into one of the most infamous unsolved cases in American history. So let's talk about the letters a little bit more. The first wave of them started in the summer of 1969. On August 1st, 1969, just weeks after the Blue Rock Springs shooting, 3 nearly identical letters arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. Each letter claimed responsibility for the Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs attacks, and inside each was 1/3 of a 408-character cipher. The killer demanded the newspapers publish the ciphers, or more lives would be taken. And each letter began with the phrase that would become his signature: "This is the Zodiac speaking." Within days of the letters popping up, a local couple, Donald and Betty Hardin of Salinas, cracked the puzzle. But the answers didn't reveal the killer's true identity or name, as he had teased. The Zodiac had delivered on his promise, but he remained anonymous. In November 1969, he sent what became known as the 340-character cipher to the Chronicle, and for decades, cryptographers, FBI analysis, and amateur codebreakers tried to solve it. It wasn't until December 2020 that a team of private citizens finally cracked the code using computer-assisted analytics. The message turned out to be another taunt, saying that he wasn't afraid of the gas chamber, and again referencing the afterlife. And just like the first cipher, it offered no identity, no smoking gun, just more games. As I've already hinted at, handwriting experts have examined every single one of the Zodiac's letters over the years. But beyond the writing itself, some experts chose to focus on the language. For instance, the Zodiac used phrases like blue meanies, trigger mechanism, and paradise. He also misspelled words inconsistently, sometimes correctly, sometimes phonetically. So experts in linguistics have debated whether this was intentional misdirection or an insight into his genuine education level. Another question we simply don't have the answer to. From 1969 through the mid-1970s, dozens of letters were attributed to the Zodiac. Some were confirmed authentic, others remained disputed. Some contained threats, others contained physical evidence. But when stacked together, the letters really formed a chilling portrait of a killer who wasn't content to just kill. He wanted to control the entire narrative. He wanted to taunt law enforcement. He wanted the public to be absolutely terrified about what he might do next or who his next victims could be. And for forensic investigators, they represented both the best chance at solving the case and the greatest frustration. The letters gave handwriting, ciphers, saliva on envelopes, fingerprints on paper, but none of that has led to a name yet. If there's one question everyone asks about the Zodiac today, it's this: why haven't they tested the DNA? The truth is, they have, multiple times, but the results have either been limited, inconclusive, and/or controversial. When talking about the DNA, we have to start in the 1990s, which is when the authorities made their first DNA effort. Like we've already talked about in so many episodes of the show so far, by the late 90s, DNA testing was completely changing cold cases, and the Zodiac is no different. The police turned to his letters, hoping saliva from the envelope flaps or stamps might have a genetic profile. Some of the samples were tested, but most of them were too degraded or too small to get any consistent results. At best, they developed partial DNA profiles, not a full sequence. Partials can be used to compare against suspects, but they usually aren't good enough to make a definitive identification. When I talk about how the Zodiac case could be solved, we'll talk about how DNA in this case could still be very useful. But for now, let's go back to a name you heard at the start of the episode, Arthur Lee Allen. For a long time, Allen remained pretty much at the top of the suspect list. He was a former elementary school teacher and convicted sex offender who many people thought could be the Zodiac. And even though he was questioned many times by the police over the years, he always denied it. But when his DNA was compared to the letters, there was no match. His DNA never matched anything related to this case. The same went for several other persons of interest. No match. But here's just some food for thought. If the Zodiac had someone else lick his stamps or his envelopes, or if contamination occurred, then negative results don't necessarily clear anyone. He could have thought of everything beforehand. He knew by licking the envelopes, he was leaving his DNA behind. So maybe he had someone else do it. Just something to think about. Moving forward a couple of years to 2002. In 2002, the Vallejo Police Department made a pretty shocking announcement. They said they had been able to obtain a partial DNA profile from Zodiac's letters. This partial was also able to definitively exclude Allen and a few others. But again, it wasn't a complete sequence. They could be good for excluding certain people, but it certainly didn't include anyone either. That brings us to the next point about the DNA evidence. After the Golden State Killer arrest in 2018, the obvious question was, could the same forensic genealogy technique work for the Zodiac? Most of us are very familiar with the GSK case by now. In 2018, investigators finally identified Joseph James DeAngelo using forensic genetic genealogy. By uploading a crime scene DNA profile into public genealogy databases, they were able to trace relatives, build out a family tree, and ultimately pinpoint DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer. It was the case that proved just how powerful this new forensic tool could be for solving decades-old mysteries. So could that same technology be used in this case? Well, that same year, the Vallejo Police Department confirmed they had submitted samples for genealogy analysis in partnership with GEDmatch, but no definitive results came from it. Now, it's unclear why the analysis wasn't successful. All we know is that the Vallejo police didn't have any luck with it. And according to the FBI, they haven't been able to use genetic genealogy successfully either. They have said they're still exploring its use to try to nail down who this guy could be, But again, so far with the police departments locally and at the federal level, it hasn't worked. Now, just to recap, here's the DNA we actually have. According to statements by the San Francisco Police Department and Vallejo investigators, the Zodiac evidence includes at least one partial male profile from a letter, a bloody fingerprint at Paul Stein's cab, though never conclusively tied to the killer, and the palm print from the payphone in Napa. I think it's fair to say that it's very possible that one of these could hold the key. Will it be through a direct comparison eventually? Or could it be through genealogy and one of the public databases? I guess time will only tell. Despite the limited and often inconclusive DNA results, interest in unmasking the Zodiac has never faded. And in recent years, that determination has even spilled outside official investigations. In 2021, a private group calling themselves the Case Breakers claimed that they had identified the Zodiac as Gary Post, a house painter who died in 2018. They cited photo comparisons, a scar on his forehead, and alleged links to military service. They even said he had confessed to the murders to at least 6 people before his death. And as for the forensics, the group specifically points to military-style boot prints from the crime scenes matching his exact size and his exact style. The group also suspected that Gary might have been responsible for the 1966 murder of Sherry Jo Bates in Riverside, California, an unsolved crime they believe was the Zodiac's first. Forensic evidence at the Bates crime scene allegedly includes a paint-splattered wristwatch found by investigators. But could Gary be the Zodiac? Well, if you ask the FBI, they maintain the investigation is, quote, still open and unsolved. A pretty clear answer to the question of whether they think this is the guy or not. 2 years later, in 2023, the Case Breakers released another statement claiming that an FBI whistleblower revealed Gary was secretly listed as a suspect in their database since 2016, and that the FBI had a partial DNA sample. However, the FBI has not publicly confirmed these allegations. Without cold, hard forensic evidence, theories like Gary Post remain just that, speculation. The real key to solving Zodiac's identity will almost certainly come from science. And that brings us to the future of DNA technology. As a consumer of true crime and forensic science content, you know that DNA technology is advancing every single day, and it's advancing very fast. Techniques like whole genome sequencing and ultra-sensitive DNA recovery have allowed companies like Othram to solve cases once thought unsolvable. Again, if you've been a listener of my show for a while, you've heard me talk about Othram all of the time and all of the amazing things that they've been able to do for old cold cases. So here's what I think is possible. If a clean sample of the Zodiac's DNA actually exists, we can still figure out who he is. Maybe he's already dead. Maybe he's still alive, living his life somewhere, always looking over his shoulder. I think it's still possible that through forensic testing, we can identify him one day. But when exactly will that day come? I think when we look at the Zodiac case today, it's tempting to see only failure, decades of investigation, hundreds of suspects, and still no answers. But the story of the Zodiac is also the story of forensic science itself, its limitations then and its potential now. Fast forward to today, And we've seen cases once thought completely unsolvable finally crack open. The Golden State Killer, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, identified through forensic genetic genealogy. The boy in the box was given his name after 65 years, thanks to advanced DNA testing. And John and Jane Doe cases across the country are being solved almost every single week. That's why many forensic experts still believe the Zodiac could be solved. And to be completely honest, the Zodiac case isn't just about identifying one man. It's about closure for all of these victims' families and their loved ones. We all want that. Forensics couldn't catch the Zodiac in 1969, but it still might half a century later. The Zodiac Killer remains one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history. His crimes were brutal, his letters unforgettable, and his identity still hidden. But what this case shows us 300 episodes later is that forensic science is never finished. Each new method, each new discovery keeps hope alive that one day even the Zodiac's shadow will finally come to light. And with that, that's all for today's episode of Forensic Tales. But before we close, I want to take a moment to recognize something special. This marks our 300th episode together. 300 stories, 300 families, 300 reminders of why truth and justice matter. When I launched this show, I never imagined the journey that it would take us on, the cases we've explored, the breakthroughs we have witnessed, and the community we have built along the way. None of this would be possible without you, the listener, who tune in week after week, share these stories with me, and keep the memories of the victims alive. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Here's to the next 300 episodes, the cases still waiting to be told, and the hope that one day every mystery will find an answer. I'm Courtney Fretwell, and this has been the 300th episode of Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to help create compelling new cases, fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. Thank you so much to this week's newest Patreon supporter, Shondi. To learn more, visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers, Tony A., Christine B., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, Ann F., Carol A., Shannon D., Marianne C., Lois B., Lynn H., Ashley H., Danielle D., Chrissy D., Brett R., Luz Raquel, and Christine K. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or email me at Courtney@forensictales.com. Thank you for listening and see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Before we get back to the episode, if you're listening on Spotify, please take a moment to tap 5 stars. It's one of the easiest ways to support Forensic Tales and helps the show reach new listeners. Thank you so much for being here.
The residents of a small lake town in the state of Washington could have never prepared themselves for what happened in early 1999. a string of crimes that almost seemed more fiction than reality. They involved murder, arson, fraud and embezzlement, and it involved suicide. How could the use of advanced forensic science techniques finally bring the town the justice they so desperately need? This week on Forensic Tales, we cover the serial killer. Welcome to Forensic Tales. As always, I'm your host, Courtney. Each Monday, we release a new episode that discusses real, bone-chilling true crime stories and how forensic science has been used in the case. Some cases have been solved through cutting-edge forensic techniques, while other cases remain unsolved. If you love the show, make sure you leave us a rating with a review. This will greatly help me out. And if you want access to bonus content and be one of the first to listen to new weekly episodes of the show, head over to our Patreon page, patreon.com/Forensic Tales. This is also where you can go to simply support my show. Every little bit helps. Now, let's get to this week's episode. Hi, Forensic Tales listeners, and happy Memorial Day. Our story this week involves not only murder and forensic science, but it also involves arson. It has fraud and embezzlement, and it even has suicide. And it takes place in a town called Newman Lake, Washington, which is a place just about 20 miles from the city of Spokane. Newman Lake is an unincorporated part of Washington that's pretty much trees on top of trees. And one of its residents, Robert, or Bob Wood, who was 42 years old at the time, and his two children, 16-year-old Teresa Wood and 11-year-old Christopher Wood, moved to Newman Lake right after Bob became divorced from his second wife. And at the time, Bob gained custody of both children, and they all settled in to Newman Lake as a new family of three. In early 1999, Bob Wood worked in the real estate business there in Washington at a company called Crown West Realty. And he was making some pretty decent money there. His reported salary was well over $100,000. I mean, that's a pretty decent paycheck here in 2020. So I would imagine that over $100,000 a year back in the late 90s was a pretty darn good salary. And I would certainly be pretty happy with that kind of salary. And Bob Wood built a pretty nice home and life for himself and his two young children. He purchased the home in Newman Lake for around $80,000. He purchased a trampoline for the backyards for the kids to play on. He put in a new garage, and he even put a nice new jacuzzi right there in his master bedroom. On February 9th, 1999, 16-year-old Teresa Wood, Bob's older daughter, headed out of the house a little after 8 o'clock in the morning for school. Because she's in high school, she's usually the first one out of the house in the morning, and she usually leaves well before her dad, Bob, leaves the house for work. And her younger brother heads out of the house for middle school. So once Teresa leaves the house, Bob also leaves for work around 8:20 a.m. that morning, which leaves 11-year-old Christopher alone in the house. Now, I don't know if it's exactly wise to leave just an 11-year-old behind alone before school. Maybe it's only for just a few minutes each morning, but hey, I am not a parent yet, so I guess I cannot be the judge of any parenting styles here. So Christopher stays behind in the home alone. He finishes up his breakfast, and then it's time for him to leave the house and head to school himself. So Bob Wood goes to work around 8:20 a.m. His son Christopher leaves the house a few minutes after that. But then, around 8:30 a.m., a neighbor of Bob's sees thick black smoke coming from the middle part of the house and quickly calls 911. The neighbors have no idea who is inside the house, but what they know for sure is that the house is completely engulfed in flames. Newman Lake firefighters are able to put the fire out, but not before the fire did some pretty extensive damage on the house. The whole middle section of the house was practically burnt down to the ground. And neighbors knew that Bob left the house to go check on some property up north of Spokane that morning, and that Bob's older daughter, Teresa, had already left for high school. The neighbors told firefighters that they weren't sure that if Bob's younger son, Christopher, had left the house yet or not. The neighbor starts frantically calling Bob, trying to get a hold of him on his cell phone. But he can't seem to get in touch with him. And after calling Bob on his cell phone for about an hour, Bob finally picks up the phone and says that he's about 40 minutes away from the house and that he's on his way. He shows up at the house about 2 hours later, around 10:30 a.m., and he tells police that he's concerned that his son Christopher has had problems in the past of playing with matches, and that it's possible that his son may have started the fire right there inside the house. And maybe he ran off because he was scared. Now, one of Bob's neighbors, Ron Adamson, had already started looking for Christopher. He went around the house looking for any sign of footprints in the snow. He got into his car and he started driving around the neighborhood, just looking for any sign of Christopher. And firefighters start frantically searching through the house to look for any signs that Christopher may have still been inside the house when the fire started. But they were pretty quickly able to determine that there was no sign of Christopher or a body or anything like that inside the house or where the fire started. But if Christopher wasn't inside the house, the next concern was that he may have started the fire himself, like what his father Bob had already suggested to the police. Remember, he's only 11 years old, so I think if I accidentally started a fire inside my dad's house, even close to that age, I would probably run away too. I mean, you couldn't really blame the kid if that's exactly what happened. Now, flyers with Christopher's face were posted everywhere throughout the town. And pretty quickly after the fire, a search party was formed to start searching for Christopher throughout the community and nearby fields. He was last seen wearing a Dallas Cowboys jacket, and he was only about 4 feet tall. So Christopher's dad, Bob, goes on a local news station pretty much begging his son to return home, pretty much certain that he's run away. Bob says, "Hey, please come home. You aren't in any trouble. We just want you to come home." By now, a full-on manhunt begins to find Christopher. I mean, he's only 11 years old. The day after the fire, Christopher's Dallas Cowboy backpack is discovered about 15 miles away from the house. And it was apparent that the backpack belonged to Christopher because his name had been printed on the outside, and inside the backpack were Christopher's inline skates. But it was just the backpack. There's still no sign of Christopher anywhere. Washington State firefighters brought in fire dogs to basically help them in the investigation because, again, it was pretty clear that the fire had been started on purpose. This was not some sort of accident. So the fire dogs are called in, they sniff around the house a little bit, but they don't really find anything valuable in the investigation. All they really know by this point is that the fire originated inside of the family room, likely on one of the couches, which again, all points to arson. By the next morning, people are still searching for missing Christopher. He hasn't been heard or seen by anyone in over 48 hours, which is increasingly concerning for the police and Christopher's family because he is just so young. On that second day, Bob Wood receives the phone call that no parent wants to ever receive. Bob learns that a snowplower has discovered Christopher's body about 50 miles away in a pile of snow. When police arrive at Christopher's body, it appears that he was likely killed somewhere else and that his body was dumped there. And that's because police don't find anything around the body, and they can tell that the snow around him isn't disturbed at all. It doesn't look like there was a fight or a struggle. So now, the police don't just have a case of arson on their hands. Now they have an arson and a homicide to investigate. Christopher's autopsy revealed ligature marks around his neck, and the medical examiner concluded that the likely cause of death was strangulation. Now, it's pretty hard to imagine or even comprehend a little 11-year-old boy being strangled to death. But what was also important about the autopsy was that there weren't any signs that Christopher had started the fire at his dad's house. There wasn't any smoke or soot on his hands or his clothes. He didn't have any smoke inside of his lungs, nothing. And what was also strange was that Christopher's shoes were on the wrong foot. Like the left shoe was on the right and vice versa. Not something that you would expect to see for a kid who ran off after starting a house fire. He also had what looked like vomit all over himself. Now, with the understanding that Christopher didn't start the fire at his dad's house, and the medical examiner ruled his death a homicide, the question became, who started the fire? And now, who killed Christopher? Was it the same person? Was it two different people? Are they related? Are they not? Police needed to find out the answers to so many unanswered questions. Washington police originally thought that this might be the crime of a sex offender, largely because Christopher was so young, only 11 years old. And this is a type of crime that we see from sex offenders who target young children. And the police found out pretty quickly that there were a handful of known sex offenders who lived right there in Christopher's neighborhood. But Christopher's autopsy didn't reveal any evidence that he had been sexually assaulted either before or after his death. There just wasn't any evidence of that. So, without any evidence of a sexual assault, it's not really likely that a local sex offender in the area would have killed him, let alone start the fire inside the home. That just doesn't fit the MO of what we see and what we know about sex offenders and their choices of crimes. So, with the idea that a sex offender likely wasn't responsible for Christopher's death, police then turn to his older sister Teresa and father Bob to basically try and get any additional information that might help them find their killer. And according to Teresa, she was the first one out of the family house that morning. That was the normal routine for the family, was that she left the house the earliest to get to high school. And Bob said pretty much the same thing, that Teresa went to school early and that he left the house around 8:20 in the morning to get to work, leaving Christopher behind to finish his breakfast. And neighbors of Bob reported to police that no one remembers seeing Christopher at any point that morning. Police have a couple more questions for Bob. And the first question that raised a couple eyebrows in the investigation was the fact that it took Bob almost 2 hours after getting the phone call about the fire to come back home. I mean, if someone called and told me that my house was on fire, I think I would probably get home faster than the person could even tell me what was happening on the phone. So when you tell me that it took him 2 hours to get home, of course that warrants a few follow-up questions. When the police start looking a little closer into Bob Wood's life, they find out that things weren't exactly as they may appear. For one, remember the $100,000 a year job in real estate he had? Well, when police looked into Bob's finances, they found out that even with a decent salary like that, Bob had a habit of spending well beyond his means. He was in a lot of personal debt. He was spending way more every month than what his salary would allow. And in fact, he was spending all kinds of money on antique and vintage cars. He just had a lot of expensive hobbies and interests. Reports indicate that around the time of the fire and Christopher's death, Bob Wood owed around $125,000. But when police dig a little deeper, maybe even more troubling than the debt, was the fact that Bob had actually been fired from his real estate job just a few weeks before the fire and Christopher's murder. When police speak with Bob's former employer, they learn that Bob was actually fired from the company in January after it was discovered that he was embezzling money. And not just a little amount of money. He was being accused of embezzling $100,000 from the company. And when the police interviewed a couple of Bob's coworkers, they claim that in addition to the money, Bob was also stealing all kinds of things from the company, including gas, equipment, and building materials that were owned by the company. Bob's coworkers also claimed that he was using company money to make repairs on his own personal cars. Police also learned that Bob Wood had also taken out 3 life insurance policies on his son Christopher. Bob had originally opened a policy on Christopher for $10,000 just to cover costs of burial services in the event of his death. And Bob's Wood ex-wife, Jolyn Wood, had purchased $50,000 policy on all 4 of her kids, including Christopher. According to Bob's ex-wife, the policies were purchased as more of an investment than anything else. Now, to be completely honest, at first, when I heard about all of these different life insurance policies on these children, I didn't really understand why a parent would do that. But while researching this case, I found out that it's actually pretty common for parents to purchase life insurance on their kids. And one study I found suggests that 1 in 5 policies in the United States are actually for kids under the age of 18. So I guess it's not as uncommon as I originally thought. But shortly after Bob's ex purchased the $10,000 life insurance policy, she wasn't able to keep up with the premium payments. So Bob took over the policy and he became the sole beneficiary to Christopher's policy. So again, Bob had recently opened these life insurance policies. And when police question Bob about them and request copies of the policy, they learn that the insurance policies had actually been conveniently removed from the house prior to the start of the fire. So Bob cooperates with the police and he gets them the copies of the insurance policies. And he says that he has absolutely nothing to hide here and that he removed the insurance policies prior to the house fire because of this very reason. He wanted to make sure that if anything happened, God forbid, right, he would have all of his important documents. Which, okay, I guess I can understand that part of Bob's story. I mean, isn't that the reason why you buy fireboxes and things like that? So you can put your important documents in. So even though it's slightly a coincidence here, I do understand where Bob is coming from. So when Bob Wood turns over the life insurance policies to the police, they total up the policies and they find out there was a total of $80,000 taken out on Christopher. Now, again, even to Bob's ex-wife Accord, the large amount of policies were taken out on Christopher largely to become an investment later on. After the fire and after the police had in their hands the life insurance policies that were taken out on Christopher, they also found out that Bob had dropped off a camera to have some photos developed at a pharmacy on February 11th. Right, this is back in the 1990s. When you wanted to take photos, you had to go take your camera in to get them developed. So the photos on the camera that Bob dropped off to have developed contained a ton of photos from inside the house where the fire started. It was basically photo after photo of each room in the house from different angles. And then there were the same exact photos from each room in the house from the same exact angles after the fire had damaged most of the house. The so-called the before and after photos were taken on the same roll of film, which in the minds of investigators kind of begs the question, did Bob take these photos because he knew the fire was going to happen? Crime scene technicians were called in to search Bob Wood's home for any forensic evidence that might explain the house fire or even Christopher's murder. Between the life insurance policies, the suspicious house fire, police had more than enough reason to suspect that Bob knew way more than what he was letting on to. Crime scene technicians start by searching Bob's garage. Now, the garage was an area of the house that wasn't damaged at all during the fire, so pretty much everything inside was completely untouched. Now, if you recall from earlier, one of Bob's hobbies was collecting expensive cars. So his garage had a number of different cars in it. And on one of these cars, crime scene technicians spotted an odd substance on one of the car's fenders. It wasn't car oil or anything like that. It was definitely out of place, not a substance that would be on the fender of a car. So technicians swabbed the fender to collect a sample of the substance and have it tested to figure out exactly what it was. The test results of the substance found on one of Bob's cars came back as human stomach contents, or vomit in other words. Police were hopeful that the vomit on the car's fender would shed some sort of light on the investigation. But vomit doesn't contain any DNA. So they weren't testing the stomach contents to pull any DNA evidence from it. They wanted to test to see what exactly they could find in the contents. The stomach contents were sent to a special forensics lab for testing. The sample was put under a microscope, and the examiner could make out a very small vegetative fragments, like pieces of oat and other starchy grains. So the sample was removed from the microscope and placed with a mixture of potassium iodine. Potassium iodine is a chemical that is often used in forensic science. And in this case, scientists use potassium iodine to test the vomit for the presence of different substances. When the iodine solution is applied to the vomit, the starches in the stomach contents will turn a purplish bluish color, which indicates a positive test result for the presence of starches. In this case, the potassium iodine came back positive. So, okay, what does all of this really mean? Well, it means that the stomach contents contained a large amount of oat, bran, corn, wheat, a lot of starches. All ingredients that are super common in one of my favorite breakfast choices, cereal. So, police have now concluded that the unknown substance swabbed from Bob's wood car was stomach contents that contained many of the same ingredients as cereal, meaning whoever that vomit belonged to most likely ate cereal or something very starchy. As soon as the substance found on the car was identified, forensic scientists were able to match it to the same exact substance that was found on Christopher's shirt when his body was discovered. Christopher also had the same stomach contents right there on his shirt with the same starchy evidence. Forensic and police had suspected that the stomach contents found on Christopher's shirt and on one of Bob's car fenders contained many of the same ingredients as cereal. They really didn't have to look very long, because right there inside of Bob's kitchen, there was a half-full box of Marshmallow Mateys cereal, which, if you didn't know, is the generic to Lucky Charms. Cereal that an 11-year-old Christopher ate each and every single morning before school. Bob Wood's house has 2 trash cans, but when police searched his property, they could only find one of the trash cans. Police found it to be pretty suspicious that after the fire and the murder of his son, that a trash can was suddenly missing from the house. Police also knew that Bob had taken his pickup truck to a local car wash the day after the house fire. So the police head over to the local car wash to see what, if any, evidence could be left behind. Again, investigators didn't have to search very long because right there at the gas station, police found the missing trash can. But did the trash can belong to Bob? Or was this some weird coincidence that a similar style trash can could also be at the car wash that Bob used just weeks before? It is possible. I'm sure many people in the neighborhood had very similar looking trash cans. The trash can found at the car wash was sent to the forensic lab for testing, just to see if they could identify the trash can as belonging to Bob Wood or someone else. Forensic scientists used a technique in which they scraped pieces of paint from the top of the trash can to then analyze the paint chips. The paint residue was placed underneath a forensic microscope to be compared to the paint residue on Bob's remaining trash can. Forensics were able to determine that the paint residue and composition of the trash can found at the car wash were a similar match to the same paint composition as Bob's. Now that the police could identify where the trash can came from, they needed to find out exactly what had been inside of the can. Investigators used a scanning electron microscope to try and find out what had been inside the trash can. This type of microscope can produce images of a sample by scanning the object's surface with a highly concentrated beam of electrons. Inside the trash can, scientists found traces of vomit. Vomit that was 100% consistent with the stomach contents found on the car fender and on Christopher's t-shirt. They also found unusual, shiny metallic particles inside of the trash can, which at first left police puzzled as to where those shiny pieces could have come from. But then they remember Christopher's backpack that had been the same exact shiny metallic pieces on it. Armed with the evidence of the stomach contents and pieces of the backpack, police were now certain that Christopher had 100%, without a doubt, been inside that trash can. But was this enough evidence to make an arrest in the case? Police felt like they still needed a little bit more. A search of Bob's cell phone records showed that his cell phone pinged a tower right near where Christopher's body was discovered on the morning of the fire, which, remember, his body was found about 50 miles away from his house, which lines up with the police timeline of Bob's whereabouts the morning of the fire, because it took him 2 hours to get back to the house after getting the phone call about the fire. But was it really possible for Bob to have set the fire inside the house, leave at the time he said, around 8:20 a.m., and have neighbors spot the smoke around 8:30? It seemed like a pretty tight timeline for everything to fall into place and leave the house undetected. So, to test this timeline, the ATF got involved in the case, and the ATF purchased 3 similar pieces of furniture where the fire was believed to have started. They wanted to see exactly how long it would take the fire to really get burning and be able to take down most of the house. In order for a fire to basically take over an entire room with flames, the fire has to be generating a lot of energy. So the ATF start a fire on a similar set of furniture, and they watch how long it takes to burn and how much energy it's producing. The ATF concluded that Bob's sofa could have produced the same amount of energy. Bob Wood was arrested and charged with setting the fire to his own home and strangling his son Christopher on February 26, 1999. That same day, he was also charged with theft of $105,000 from Crown West Realty, the company that he was fired from just 1 month before. Police and prosecutors believed that Bob waited for his daughter Teresa to go to school, then strangled Christopher to death with a rope. In the process of being strangled, it's believed that Christopher vomited, explaining the stomach contents. Next, Bob dressed Christopher, putting his shoes on the wrong foot. He carried Christopher to his pickup truck, where he brushed against the sports car, leaving the stomach contents right there on the car's fender. Christopher was put in the back of the pickup truck inside of the trash can, while Bob went back inside the family home to start the fire. On his way out of the house, he grabbed Christopher's backpack and headed out the door right at 8:20 a.m. He drove Christopher's body some 50 miles away and dumped it in a snowbank. When Bob Wood received the phone call about the fire, he drove back to the home from the dump site, throwing his son's backpack out the window. Prosecutors believed Bob tried to clean the pickup truck by taking it to a local car wash and leaving the trash can that carried Christopher's body behind. The forensic analysis of the paint proved that the trash can belonged to Bob Wood, and the biological evidence found inside the can also proved that Christopher's body had been placed inside. How could someone murder their very own 11-year-old son and set fire to their house? Well, prosecutors believed the motive was simple: money. Bob Wood had taken out 3 life insurance policies on his son and set fire to his house to gain the insurance money. Bob was in thousands and thousands of dollars in debt and had already filed for bankruptcy twice. When Bob Wood appeared in court, he adamantly denied all of the charges against him, claiming that he saw his son head out to school that morning, and he suggested Christopher himself set the fire and ran off out of fear of getting into trouble. Bob Wood was now facing arson, murder, and embezzlement charges in the state of Washington. But before his case could ever go to trial, Bob Wood was found hanging in his jail cell in May 1999. He committed suicide before he would ever be held to answer for his crimes. Even if Bob would have stood trial, the forensic evidence in the case would be nearly impossible to overcome. The identification of the stomach contents containing freshly eaten cereal on Bob's car and inside the trash can placed Christopher inside Bob's car and trash can. The paint analysis matched the trash can found at the car wash to the missing trash can at Bob's residence. And the work of arson investigators and the ATF put together a perfect timeline that proved Bob had set the fire in his very own house. What is even more tragic in this case is that the life insurance policies that were taken out on 11-year-old Christopher and the insurance he would have received from the fire wouldn't have even been enough money to pay off all of Bob Wood's debt. It was all for nothing, and just simply an act of unspeakable violence. An article that was published in the Seattle Times shortly after Bob Wood committed suicide inside of his jail cell described Christopher as a pinball kid. Christopher always had to be doing something, whether that was building a fort, riding his bicycle, or just playing video games. He was known around the school as the Tetherball King. Without a doubt, if Bob Wood was on trial, the forensic evidence would have put away another killer for the rest of his life. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. Sources for this episode include Forensic Files, Season 10, Episode 12, and the Seattle Times. For a small monthly contribution, you can get access to bonus content and be one of the first to listen to new weekly episodes. Or if you simply just want to support my show, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/forensictales. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Leaving us a rating with a review greatly helps support the show. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers, Tony Areola and Nicole Leasing. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or email me directly at Courtney@forensictales.com to find out how you can become involved. Please join me next week. We release a new episode every Monday. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.
Before we get back to the episode, if you're listening on Spotify, please take a moment to tap 5 stars. It's one of the easiest ways to support Forensic Tales and helps the show reach new listeners. Thank you so much for being here.
To get this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, please visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
On Christmas Eve 2015 in New Mexico, a peaceful jog turns into a nightmare. A young woman goes jogging along a trail she's been to so many times, but is suddenly attacked. For the next 5 years, her attacker's identity remains a mystery, until investigators in New Mexico try a new forensic technique to try and track him down. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 213, The Case of the Jogger in New Mexico. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell Areola. Forensic Tales is a weekly true crime podcast covering real, spine-tingling stories with a forensic science twist. Some cases have been solved with forensic science, while others have turned cold. Every remarkable story sends us a chilling reminder that not all stories have happy endings. As a one-woman show, your support helps me find new compelling cases, conduct in-depth fact-based research, and produce and edit this weekly show. You can support my work in 2 simple ways. Become a valued patron at patreon.com/Forensic Tales and leave a positive review. Before we get to the episode, we've got 4 new Patreon supporters to thank. Thank you so much to Kathy J., Michaela M., Eileen, and Christina M. for becoming the show's newest supporters on Patreon. Now, let's get to this week's episode. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2015, a young woman went for a jog on a drainage ditch along the Rio Grande south of Rio Bravo in New Mexico. The woman went out there that day thinking that it was just going to be like any other jog. Not only was this a popular spot for her, but it was also a popular spot for a lot of local runners. So she went out there that day to go running. She didn't think much about it. She'd get her exercise in and then go about the rest of her Christmas Eve. But that's far from what happened. Before going into too much detail, it's worth mentioning that the victim's name won't be mentioned in this episode. We'll refer to her as the victim because that's how she'd like to remain, and I want to respect that. I also won't get into much detail about who she is or what she's doing now. That Christmas Eve, as she was running her regular route, she saw a guy that caught her attention. He wasn't doing anything suspicious or weird. He just looked like he was out there for a run, just like she was. But there was something about him that just made her spiny senses go off in her head. But once the guy ran past her, she put him out of her mind. A little while later, when she got farther down the trail, she saw the same guy again. Like before, he looked like he was out there exercising. It wouldn't be the first time she came across another runner that day. But this time, he was standing next to a tree and looked like he was talking to someone on the phone. A little weird for him to be on the phone if he's out there for a run. But maybe it was an emergency. But something about him still didn't feel right, and she didn't know what to do. If she turned around and ran back the same way she came in, it would look too obvious. And if he wasn't really out there doing anything wrong, then she thought it might look a little bit weird. So the only way out of there was to run directly past him and the tree. So she took a deep breath and ran past him. But as soon as she did, the man sprinted toward her and tackled her to the ground. There was absolutely nothing she could do at that point. As soon as they were on the ground and he was on top of her, she knew she was in trouble. So she tried to plead with the guy's human side. She told him she was a mother of a young child, And if he killed her or do anything bad to her, he would be leaving a child without its mother. Maybe, just maybe, he had a heart and wouldn't want to do this anymore. But none of this seemed to work or appeal to him. And once they were on the ground, he started sexually assaulting her. At one point during the assault, she saw the guy reach for something in his back pocket. That's when she thought, he's gonna kill me. Surely he's reaching for a gun or maybe a knife, and he's either gonna shoot or stab me to death. And she'd be dead. But to her surprise, he didn't pull out a gun, knife, or any other weapon. He didn't shoot her, he just kept assaulting her. After he was done attacking her, he pulled out his cell phone and did something really strange. He took a picture of her while she was on the ground, partially naked. It was almost like he wanted to take a photo so that he could remember this moment. At first, she tried screaming, hoping someone might hear her. But it was Christmas Eve. There weren't many people out there. Most people were either at home or doing last-minute Christmas shopping. Also, this was a pretty quiet trail. Yes, there were usually other walkers or joggers out there, but it wouldn't be uncommon to run this entire route without seeing a single person. So if someone wanted to commit a crime just like this, well, this would be the perfect spot to do it. So unfortunately, no one heard the screams. As soon as he got off of her, he seemed to run up the river trail back to the bank without saying a single word. So once she thought that he was far enough away, she got up and started running in the opposite direction. This was the moment for her to get away and call for help, not knowing if he was going to come back and try to follow her. Once she was able to get home, she found someone to watch her young child so that she could go find some help. But instead of heading directly to the police station, she decided to go to a crisis rape center in the area. She never went to the police to report what happened to her, and the crisis center she went to wasn't under any obligation to report what happened to the cops either. Unfortunately, this happens far more than we'd like to think. A victim is raped and doesn't want to go to the police to report it. Sometimes it's because the victim knows her attacker and doesn't want them to get into trouble. Other times it's because the victim is scared or embarrassed, and the last thing they want to do is have to retell in detail exactly what happened to them. So, some people decide to stay quiet, and that's exactly what this victim did. After she went to the rape crisis center, she went home and never went to the police. By the time law enforcement found out about the rape, it was already March 2016, about 3 months later. She had a change of heart and decided to come forward. The case was taken on by the Bernalillo Sheriff's Department in New Mexico. By this point, investigators were already well behind the ball. Whoever raped this poor girl was long gone, and valuable evidence was probably lost. The only thing they had was the rape kit, which doesn't always contain usable DNA. It also meant that this victim spent the last 3 months of her life knowing that her attacker was somewhere out there. Maybe he would come find her and do it again. Or even worse, maybe he would try to kill her. So to try and catch up, the first thing the cops did was sit down with the victim. They needed to get her story and a good description of what the person looked like. She told detectives everything that happened, why she was out there that day, and how she first spotted the man. She even talked about the strange thing he did by pulling out his cell phone and taking a picture of her. Then she told them what he looked like. According to her, the guy was wearing a hat, but you could still see parts of his thick brown hair hanging out the back and the sides. He had brown eyes and looked like he had recently shaved, so he didn't have any facial hair. His skin was tan, like maybe he was Hispanic, but he could also be Caucasian. She thought he was around 5 feet 7 inches tall and didn't have any tattoos, or at least none that she could see. He wore a black sweatshirt and red athletic pants with a black stripe down each one of the legs. Now, as far as a witness description goes, this was textbook. It was exactly what every law enforcement officer hoped for. That's because a lot of victims in these situations can't remember what their attacker looked like, or maybe they just never got a good look at them. So for this victim to provide such a good physical description was absolutely huge for investigators. But it gets even better. It was the victim herself who drew up a sketch of her attacker. As an art teacher and artist, she was able to draw a suspect sketch at home and bring it to detectives. So they didn't need to worry about trying to translate her description to a sketch artist. Once they had a good enough sketch created, the police did their best to circulate the image out to the public. All it would take was just one good tip to come through from someone who recognized this guy. But at the end of the day, it's just a sketch. It's someone's best guess of how someone looks based on their description. And by no means is it an actual photograph of the person. So although the police had, in this case, a really, really good physical description of who they were looking for, it just wasn't enough. Maybe a few people called in saying they thought they recognized the person, but none of them turned out to be it. Early in the investigation, the police considered every single male in the victim's life as a potential suspect. They had to. All of her ex-boyfriends were looked at, including the father of her young child. Her male family members and friends were also considered. Like any other criminal investigation, the police typically start with those closest to the victim and then work their way out from there. So one by one, male family members and friends were brought in for questioning. But after each interview, they were cleared. And the case of the New Mexico jogger's rape was on the brink of turning cold. The biggest piece of evidence the police had was DNA. Even though it took 3 months for the police to hear about the rape, the crisis center she went to performed a rape kit. And through that process, they had collected unknown DNA. The DNA was put through CODIS, or the Combined DNA Index System, to see if there was a match. If her attacker had ever been arrested for a serious crime before, chances are their DNA was already in CODIS. But, to a lot of detectives' disappointment, there wasn't a match in CODIS. And once again, they were back at the beginning. Several months after the start of the investigation, the victim called the New Mexico police. This time it was to say that she thought she saw her attacker at a local sandwich shop. According to her, as soon as she stepped into the sandwich shop, she thought she saw the guy who looked exactly like the guy who attacked her. He had the same short brown hair, he was the same height, weight, everything. So as soon as she laid eyes on him, she ran out and called detectives. Well, after hearing this, the police got a search warrant to investigate this sandwich guy. If he looked like their suspect, then, well, he was certainly worth looking into and getting a search warrant. But that was a dead end. The search warrant didn't turn up anything connected to the rape, and as it turned out, this guy was completely innocent. The only thing he was guilty of was looking exactly like a rape suspect. Months quickly turned into years, and hope began to fade. And the victim thought she might have to live her entire life not knowing who attacked her, while law enforcement was left with the real possibility that their suspect got away with the perfect rape. And if he did it once, he would probably do it again. Because this wasn't done by someone the victim knew, it was most likely done by a complete stranger. So, what are the chances this was this person's first and only rape? Well, chances are it wasn't. It might have been the first attack, but law enforcement didn't think so. These types of offenders usually strike more than once. It would be extremely rare for this to be just a one-off situation, where he only rapes someone once and then never does it again. So the longer they went without making an arrest, the greater fear became that there would be additional victims out there. And as far as the victim is concerned, again, she lived in complete fear. For months, and then eventually years, she feared that this person would come back for her. Maybe he would rape her again, or maybe he would do something worse. Between 2015, when the rape happened, through 2019, the case pretty much remained cold and at a standstill. The police in New Mexico continued to work it and received tips every once in a while, but that was it. There weren't any major leads in the case for months. That is, until 2019. By the summer of 2019, the police in New Mexico went to the district attorney's office with an idea. They wanted to see if forensic genetic genealogy could be used in a case like this. Everything else had failed at that point, but they did have unknown DNA from the rape kit, so this made it a perfect case for genetic genealogy. By the summer of 2019, every police department across the country had heard about genetic genealogy. It was impossible to miss after everyone heard about the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, better known as the Golden State Killer. In that case, DeAngelo had committed countless murders and rapes all up and down California's coast for years without being arrested. In many of the attacks, the police had his DNA, but the problem was trying to identify him. His DNA had never been uploaded to CODIS or any other DNA database. So when the police kept collecting unknown DNA at all of these crime scenes, they had no one to match it with. So they turned to genetic genealogy, a process that takes unknown DNA from crime scenes and identifies relatives of the person law enforcement is searching for. So when it came to the New Mexico jogger case, forensic genetic genealogy was worth a shot. Once the DA had a chance to review the case, they immediately turned it over to the Crime Strategies Unit to begin the process. By August 2019, the police and DA's office had taken the unknown DNA from the rape kit and uploaded it to various public DNA databases, including GEDmatch and Ancestry.com. Now, the first hope is that you'll get an exact match. The suspect had previously uploaded their DNA to one of these consumer websites, and you'll get an instant hit. But that's not usually the case. It's actually very rare for law enforcement to get an exact match this way. Instead, they typically can identify distant relatives of the person they're looking for, a great-great-grandparent or a second or third cousin. In New Mexico, investigators were able to get a list of around 2,000 people who might be related to their suspect, or at least a list of 2,000 people who shared some DNA with him. From that list, they had the incredibly challenging job of narrowing it down to a single person, something that not only can take weeks or months, but sometimes it takes years. So it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Once the New Mexico police had their list of people with shared DNA, they began narrowing it down until they found someone promising. He wasn't their suspect just yet, but he was someone very close. A second cousin twice removed from the guy who had attacked the jogger. As it turned out, this second cousin, twice removed, was a guy in his 60s living hundreds of miles away in California. But the police felt pretty confident that this wasn't their suspect. He was much too old, plus lived in California and had never been to New Mexico before. So there was no reason for him to be out there jogging in 2015. But it was still something. They finally had a blood relative, even if it was just a second cousin. After a little more digging, the police figured out that this cousin had uploaded his DNA to GEDmatch.com several years earlier. He probably did it so that he could find out more about his relatives, like we usually all do when we submit our DNA. Well, now that his DNA was being used to catch a rapist, because from his DNA, police in New Mexico now had two names for their jogger case: a father and son who just so happened to live in that part of New Mexico. The first one they ruled out was the father. he didn't match the victim's description and he was a little bit too old. So that left his son, now 23-year-old Angel Gurule, the second cousin twice removed from the person they found on GEDmatch. Just like with everyone else, the police needed to rule him out. Just because he had shared DNA didn't mean he was the perp. But before they could get his DNA to be tested, the police started to wonder if this could finally be their guy. When the assault happened, Angel would have been 18 years old, the perfect age to do this. He also matched the victim's description: dark brown hair, brown eyes, the same body type, and no facial hair or tattoos. But before any arrests could be made, the police needed to be sure. Investigators needed a sample of his DNA to compare against the DNA from the victim's rape kit. So to get his DNA, the police came up with a plan. They would secretly follow Angel until he dropped something or threw something away containing his DNA, like a coffee cup or a cigarette butt. That way, they didn't need to get a search warrant. So over the next several weeks, the New Mexico police watched Angel's every move. They followed him everywhere. When Angel went to work, an undercover officer watched him. When he was at home or took out the trash, the police waited. But nothing really seemed to turn up. There wasn't anything usable. And then finally, after this went on for days, the police got their chance. Angel went to Caseman Hospital to visit his wife. She was being seen there as a patient. But before they left the hospital, a couple of officers saw that Angel had left a styrofoam cup inside one of the waiting rooms. So as soon as they left, they swooped in and grabbed it. Luckily for them, the cup had plenty of Angel's DNA. But, like most DNA tests, the results weren't instant. Even though the police put a rush order to the crime lab to test the cup as soon as possible, they still had to wait at least a couple of days to hear back. And while they waited, everyone was on pins and needles. But in the end, the wait was well worth it. The results were a match. Angel Gurule's DNA matched the DNA from the jogger's rape kit 5 years earlier. Angel Gurule's identification was absolutely huge for law enforcement agencies all across New Mexico. This was the first of its kind. It was the first time law enforcement had used forensic genetic genealogy to arrest someone in a rape investigation. Up until that point, most agencies just relied on the suspect's DNA being in CODIS. Once genetic genealogy had identified Angel, the police were now able to arrest him. When officers showed up on his front doorstep, he didn't seem too surprised. Maybe he had been waiting for this day to come. Instead of putting up any kind of fight, he simply put his hands behind his back. During his entire interview, Angel was extremely cooperative. He didn't argue with anyone and answered any questions the interviews threw at him. He even agreed to go with them to the running trail where the assault happened, so that detectives could fully understand what exactly happened that day. Now, maybe Angel was a little naive for being so cooperative with the police. Maybe he didn't know he didn't have to answer any of their questions if he didn't want to, and he could have simply stopped the interview by asking for a lawyer. Or maybe he was ready to face the music and finally come clean. Let's not forget, it had already been 5 years. So for the past 5 years, he's also had to live with this. When detectives asked him why he did it, he didn't really seem to have an answer. He just said, this young woman came running past him. She was by herself. And at that moment, he decided to follow her, and then he decided to attack her. He said he didn't go to the running trail that day to commit a rape. It was just something that happened. He didn't even know who this woman was. She wasn't a friend or anything, and he had never seen her before in his life. That was the first time that they had ever met. And as far as guilt was concerned, he told the officers he felt really bad about what happened. He's had to think and live with this for the last 5 years. Now, of course, his feelings are nothing compared to the victim's feelings, who has also had to live with this for the past 5 years. So there wasn't too much sympathy for Angel Gurule or his feelings. Detectives also asked him about the photo, the one he took of the victim while she was naked and he was assaulting her. And this is what he said. It was a trophy. He wanted to capture the moment. Although he claimed it wasn't planned or premeditated, he needed something to remember this moment. Instead of going to trial, Angel agreed to a plea deal with prosecutors and agreed to plead guilty to 2 counts of rape. Instead of facing up to 80 years in prison, Angel walked away with only a 12-year sentence for agreeing to plead guilty. That means he could be released from prison when he's still in his 30s, with plenty of life ahead of him. He's also required to undergo behavioral health treatment while incarcerated. But is 12 years a really justified sentence? Especially when he was facing up to 80 years behind bars if he didn't take the plea deal. Well, if you ask the victim or many other rape victims, they would probably say no. 12 years in prison isn't nearly long enough for an admitted rapist. Even when you consider how young someone like Angel Gurule is. Again, he's probably only going to be in his 30s by the time he's paroled or released from prison. And that means he's got his entire life ahead of him, even though he'll forever be labeled as a convicted felon and a sexual predator. He still has his whole life ahead of him. Another reason why he might have gotten this sentence was because of his cooperation. Not just during his police interview, but even after his arrest. He was also cooperative with the judge and prosecutors. And even at his sentencing hearing, he expressed remorse for what he had done, saying in part, quote, "I am completely sorry for what I committed. I am sorry to my victim. I completely blame myself." End quote. Some of Angel's background and childhood might have also been considered, especially during his sentencing. When Angel was only 2 months old, his father was accused of killing his then 2-year-old older brother. And after that, Angel was sent to go live with a family in foster care. He was eventually adopted by a family and ended up in New Mexico. But the abuse didn't really stop in his life even after he was adopted. So when it came to sentencing, his defense lawyers were really able to argue that there should be some mitigating factors to consider. Some might agree with it, while others might not. Now here's where there might have been some additional aggravating factors beyond the crime itself. Just a few months before the jogger was attacked, Angel Gurule was accused of raping a 14-year-old girl from a church group where he was the group leader. He was 19 at the time and the victim was only 14. In that particular incident, Angel was accused of having sex with a minor. The girl's family had walked in and confronted him and went to the police. The cops took the used bed sheets that they were both on to have them tested, and they took statements from the family members and the minor herself. But that's where the investigation seemed to suddenly stop. It's unclear whether or not the bed sheets were ever really tested for any type of forensic evidence, and Angel was never arrested or charged with statutory rape. This incident only really came to light after he was arrested in the jogger's case. But it definitely shows a pattern of behavior. This wasn't the first time Angel Gurule committed a sex offense. Today, Angel Gurule is serving his sentence in a New Mexico prison facility. He's been ordered to serve 12 years and will be required to be on probation for several more years once he's finally released. Will he be rehabilitated and never offend again? Only time will tell. As far as this case goes, it's become a landmark case for the entire state of New Mexico. It's become the first of its kind to be solved through forensic genetic genealogy. Without it, a rapist might still be on the streets and able to reoffend. But because a relative had submitted his DNA to a public database, law enforcement was able to identify their suspect. And hopefully, before any more victims are harmed, law enforcement can use genetic genealogy to solve rapes, murders, and the most heinous of crimes. To share your thoughts on the story, be sure to follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. To find out what I think about the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode where I share my personal thoughts and opinions about the case. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you don't miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, consider leaving us a positive review or tell friends and family about us. You can also help support the show through Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Please join me next week. We'll have a brand new case and a brand new story to talk about. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell Areola. For a small monthly contribution, you can help create new compelling cases for the show, help fund research, and assist with production and editing costs. For supporting the show, you'll become one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and snag exclusive show merchandise not available anywhere else. To learn about how you can support this show, head over to our Patreon page, patreon.com/forensictales, or simply click the support link in the show notes. You can also support the show by leaving a positive review or telling friends and family about us. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers, Tony A., Nicole G., Christine B., Karen D., Nancy H., Sherry A., Michael D., Nicola, Jerry M., Brian W., Megan G., Ureli, Jerry, and Ann F. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at Courtney@forensictales.com to find out how you can become involved. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Before we get back to the episode, if you're listening on Spotify, please take a moment to tap 5 stars. It's one of the easiest ways to support Forensic Tales and helps the show reach new listeners. Thank you so much for being here. To get this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, please visit patreon.com/forensictales. You know the stories, but have you ever stopped to ask yourself, why? Why would someone holster a semi-automatic rifle to begin a heartless shooting rampage? Why do serial killers methodically single out their next helpless victim? Why are thousands of innocent lives taken instantly? So far this year, over 300 mass shootings have occurred in the United States. Some experts believe over 2,000 serial killers are operating in the U.S. today. Unfortunately, these events happen so frequently that we've become numb. Behind every massacre, there lies a reason. Sometimes they're obvious. Many mass murderers have similar traits: sensation-seeking, lack of remorse, impulsivity, need for control, and predatory behavior. But other times, massacres are almost impossible to explain. This is Anatomy of a Massacre, Rockefeller Audio's newest podcast series. Anatomy of a Massacre is a true crime podcast investigating the most notorious massacres in human history. From serial killers to mass shooters to genocides, there lies a new horrid reason to expose in each episode. Join your host, Courtney Fretwell, a forensic psychologist, as she dives deep into the psychology, criminal theories, and policy implications behind each tragedy. New episodes of Anatomy of a Massacre are available right now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite shows. You know what happened? Now, let's uncover why.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
Adrienne Shelley had big dreams of becoming an actor, screenwriter, and producer. Hollywood's newest star began having success, but she wanted more. She wanted love and a family of her own. She found both. Adrienne Shelley was living a dream life, a fairy tale Hollywood story. Then one tragic night in New York, Adrienne was found hanging from her neck in her own bedsheets. This is Forensic Tales, episode number 146, The Adrienne Shelley Story. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I am your host, Courtney Fretwell Areola. Forensic Tales is a weekly true crime podcast covering real, spine-tingling stories with a forensic science twist. Some cases have been solved with forensic science, while others have turned cold. Every remarkable story sends us a chilling reminder that not all stories have happy endings. As a one-woman show, your support helps me find new exciting cases, conduct in-depth, fact-based research, produce and edit this weekly show. As a thank you for supporting the show, you'll get early ad-free access to weekly episodes, shout-outs in episodes, priority on case suggestions, and access to weekly bonus episodes. To support Forensic Tales, please visit patreon.com/Forensic Tales, or simply click the link in the show notes. You can also support the show by leaving a positive rating with a review. Now, let's get to this week's episode. Just before 6 p.m. on November 1st, 2006, the New York City Police Department received a phone call. The call came in about a female body found inside an Arbington Square apartment in Manhattan's West Village. When the NYPD officers arrived at the apartment, they found a woman inside the bathroom hanging from the shower rod with a bedsheet tied around her neck. The woman appeared to have hung herself in an apparent suicide. The man who called the police was Andy Ostroy, the chairman and CEO of the marketing firm Belardi Ostroy. Andy told the police that the woman found hanging from the shower rod was his wife, 40-year-old Adrienne Shelley. The NYPD police officers instantly recognized the name. Adrienne Levine was a successful actress, screenwriter, and director, better known by the stage name Adrienne Shelley. Born in Queens, New York, Adrienne Shelley grew up with her parents, Elaine Langbaum and Sheldon Levine. When Adrienne was only 12 years old, her father, Sheldon Levine, suddenly died from a heart attack. His death was extremely difficult for Adrienne. The two were very close, and her father was only 40 years old. After losing her father, Adrienne began to see the world from a new lens. The death made her realize how short life can be. His loss taught her to live life to the fullest because she knew that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. After graduating high school in New York, Adrienne enrolled at classes at Boston University, where she planned on studying journalism. but she quickly changed her major from journalism to film production. Her time at Boston University only lasted a couple of years. By her junior year in 1987, Adrienne decided to drop out of college and move to Manhattan, New York, to pursue her dreams of becoming an actress. She knew it would be difficult, but she was determined to do whatever it took to become a full-time actress. And if it meant dropping out of college, moving, and working multiple jobs to make ends meet, she was willing to do it. Not long after she got to Manhattan, she started making a name for herself in several independent films. First was her 1989 role in The Unbelievable Truth, and then her 1999 role in the movie Trust. By 1991, Adrienne was listed as one of the 12 most promising actors in John Willis's 43rd volume of Screen World. People were instantly drawn to Adrienne on screen because of her presence. Her passion and love for acting shine through when she starred in a film. Viewers instantly fell in love with Adrienne. But becoming an actor wasn't Adrienne Shelley's only dream. She also wanted to make a name for herself behind the camera. So as much as she loved performing in front of the camera, she also had a passion for storytelling. She began pursuing opportunities as a producer and screenwriter. By 2001, Adrienne's film career was starting to take off. She had become successful as an actor and was beginning to take on more significant roles behind the camera. But one part of Adrienne's life was still lacking: her love life. Adrienne was tired of dating other actors and guys involved in the industry. She would meet a guy, go on a couple dates with them, and then realize he wasn't the one. So after going on countless dates with actors and producers, Adrienne decided she needed a change. If she wanted to meet a guy who was different than anyone else she had dated in the past, she knew she needed to try something different. So she did what many singles did in the early 2000s. She signed up for Match.com. In 1995, Match.com revolutionized the dating world. Before Match.com arrived, people were limited to who they met to date. You met people at bars, or maybe were set up on a blind date by coworkers. But when Match.com came around in 1995, people began dating people they would have never met before. So when Adrienne created her profile on Match.com, she hoped to meet a guy she had never dated. She wanted someone different than an actor or a producer. Here, she met Andy Ostroy. After connecting on Match.com, Adrienne and Andy went on their first date, instantly hitting it off. Andy was just the kind of guy Adrienne hoped to meet online. 1 year after their first date, Andy proposed to Adrienne while vacationing in Paris together in 2002. 1 year after their wedding, Adrienne and Andy welcomed their first child in 2003. It was a little girl they named Sophie. Finally, everything in Adrienne's life seemed to be perfect. She had a successful career in film, she was in a happy marriage, and she became a mom to a young girl she absolutely adored. When NYPD detectives arrived at the apartment on November 1st, 2006, they questioned Adrienne's husband, Andy, for hours. They didn't believe he had anything to do with Adrienne's death because all signs pointed to a suicide. Adrienne had a bedsheet tied around her neck. She was found hanging from the curtain rod inside the bathroom. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing was missing from the apartment. Andy told NYPD detectives that the morning of November 1st, 2006 was a typical day for them. The night before, Halloween, Adrienne threw a party for their 2-year-old daughter, Sophie, and later that night, they took her trick-or-treating in the neighborhood, dressed as Cinderella. Andy told the investigators that his wife was happy. He explained that at the time of her death, Adrienne had just finished writing her screenplay Waitress, and she was waiting to find out if Waitress would be selected for the Sundance Festival. Andy told the police she was incredibly excited to find out because if Waitress made it to the Sundance Festival, that would have been a huge step forward in her screenwriting career. While Adrienne was pregnant with Sophie, she began writing her first screenplay, Waitress. It was a movie about a female waitress who loves making pies. She's married to an awful guy and goes to see this handsome and charming doctor when she becomes pregnant. It's sort of a fun and quirky film. But Adrienne wasn't the main star. Instead, she gave herself a secondary role, and the film starred Carrie Russell and Nathan Fillion. Waitress was a project that Adrienne was incredibly proud of. It marked her first major film that she wrote and produced. According to Andy, the morning of November 1st was like any other morning. Adrienne and Andy woke up, ate breakfast, and got Sophie ready for daycare. Andy said that around 9:30 a.m., he dropped Adrienne off at her apartment in the West Village. The one-bedroom apartment served as an office for Adrienne. It was a place where she could go write without having distractions at home. Andy said that after he dropped Adrienne off outside the apartment, he watched her greet the doorman and go inside. Then he drove across the city to his office while their daughter Sophie was at daycare. After Andy dropped Adrienne off at the office, he tried calling her. Andy told the NYPD detectives that he and Adrienne talked on and off all day long. They either called each other every few hours or sent each other emails. But Andy said he didn't get a response every time he called or emailed Adrienne. He told the investigators that this was extremely out of character for Adrienne because they usually chatted several times throughout the day. According to Andy, he never heard from Adrienne after he dropped her off at the apartment that morning. Around 5:45 p.m., Andy left the office and drove straight to the apartment. He and the doorman went up to Adrienne's apartment, apartment 47, and noticed that the front door was left unlocked. Initially, Andy didn't see anything unusual inside the apartment, but he knew that something was wrong. The TV was on low in the living room, and there wasn't any sign of Adrienne anywhere, until Andy got to the bathroom. That's the moment he discovered his wife hanging from the curtain rod with a bedsheet tied tightly around her neck. When paramedics arrived at the apartment, there wasn't anything they could do. Adrienne Shelley was pronounced dead at the scene, and the first assumption was that she committed suicide. There were no signs of a forced entry, no other visible wounds on her body, and no one inside the entire apartment building heard or saw anything unusual that morning. Besides there not being a suicide note, everything seemed to suggest that's what happened. So the police had no reason to suspect that this was anything but an open and shut case of suicide. And the media quickly began running stories that the famous actress Adrienne Shelley killed herself. But Andy and Adrienne's friends disagreed. The Adrienne Shelley they knew wouldn't kill herself. At the time of her death, everything was perfect in her life. She was in a happy marriage. She was waiting to find out if Waitress would be accepted at the Sundance Festival. And then there was her daughter, Sophie. According to Adrienne's loved ones, she would have never left Sophie behind without a mother. Adrienne's autopsy was performed the following day. The chief medical examiner who performed the autopsy found that she died as a result of neck compression, an injury that is highly consistent with hangings. But despite the chief medical examiner's findings, something about Adrienne's apparent suicide just didn't make sense. By Saturday, November 4th, Adrienne's husband, Andy, and her family were adamantly disputing the suicide claims in the media. In an interview with reporters, Andy told the press, quote, "I am doing everything I can, everything humanly possible to find out exactly what happened." But the police stuck to their original theory. According to them, all of the evidence pointed towards suicide. NYPD detectives knew it wasn't uncommon for family members of someone who committed suicide not to want to believe what happened. It can be difficult for someone to accept that their loved one took their own life. So it's not uncommon for family members to disagree with the police findings. But still, Andy and her family continued to press the NYPD to do something. Frustrated that the police weren't taking their claims seriously, Adrian's husband and family decided to start their own investigation. They wanted to quash this rumor that Adrian had killed herself, so they hired Dr. Michael Bodden. Dr. Bodden is a world-renowned forensic pathologist who has consulted on many high-profile criminal cases. Some of the cases he's worked on include the O.J. Simpson murder trial and the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. He was also involved in other high-profile cases like the deaths of Jeffrey Epstein and the murder of George Floyd. Besides his name appearing alongside high-profile celebrity deaths, Dr. Michael Bodden was also the chief medical examiner of New York from 1978 until 1979. Adrian's family hired Dr. Bodden to see if he could find anything to suggest her death was anything other than a suicide. They wanted a fresh set of experienced eyes to examine the evidence that the NYPD might have missed. And they wanted this done by someone completely independent from the police department. Dr. Bodden performed Adrian's second autopsy on Saturday, November 4th, as two detectives from the NYPD stood nearby at the funeral home. And based on his observations, this second autopsy, he believed that Adrian was murdered. This case wasn't a suicide, it was a homicide. Dr. Bodden found injuries and bruising on Adrian's body that he didn't believe were consistent with a suicide. Instead, according to him, the injuries to her body were more consistent with Adrian being involved in a physical struggle with someone shortly before her death. He found a lot of bruising on Adrian's face, especially around one of her eyes. And he also found small cuts on her hands, suggesting they might be defensive wounds, like she had been in a fight with someone. Almost everything Dr. Bodden found during the second autopsy was at odds with what the first medical examiner found. In the first autopsy, the examiner didn't find any injuries or evidence of a struggle. But according to Dr. Bodden's findings, Adrian was in a physical battle shortly before her death. Once his findings were released, NYPD detectives decided to look deeper into the case. They needed to find out what really happened to Adrian. The detectives decided to bring Adrian's husband, Andy, back in for questioning. They asked Andy about the particular knot used to tie the bedsheet around her neck. Investigators preserved the knot and showed it to Andy, and they asked him if Adrian had any experience tying knots. He said no. Adrian had zero experience with any type of knot. In most suicide cases, a person will tie a knot they're familiar with. The knot used in Adrian's case was rather complicated. As investigators looked through the apartment for the second time, they noticed a footprint on the top of the toilet lid they hadn't seen before. They also found two more footprints, one on the floor and the other on the edge of the bathtub. The footprints were compared to Adrian's shoe size, and they didn't match. The footprints were much larger than her feet. The prints also didn't match anyone who would have been inside the apartment, including Andy and including all of the first responding officers. Investigators decided that the footprints were suspicious enough to hire an expert to look at them, and the expert concluded that the prints came from a Reebok sneaker. On November 5th, 4 days after Adrian's death, detectives returned to the apartment looking for clues that might lead them to the owner of that Reebok sneaker. When they got there, they noticed there was an unusual dust just outside Adrian's apartment in the hallway. The dust was strange because it was only outside Adrian's apartment and it wasn't found in front of any of the other apartments on the floor. When the detectives looked at the dust closer, they saw another footprint. So they compared the footprint found just outside of Adrian's apartment to the 3 footprints in the bathroom. And when the results came back, the footprints all matched. They all came from the same Reebok sneaker. The first thing investigators wanted to find out was where the dust came from. And why was it only found on the floor just outside Adrian's apartment? The police discovered a renovation happening in apartment 37, the unit directly below Adrian's apartment. Investigators went down to the apartment to see if they could find any footprints in the dust. They discovered yet another footprint, a print left behind by the same Reebok. The investigation shifted from finding more footprints to finding the person who owned that particular pair of shoes. And if they found them, that could tell investigators who was inside Adrian's apartment. A few NYPD detectives reached out to the apartment building owners to see if they could get a list of people who worked on the renovation project in the apartment below Adrian's. This led investigators to a basement apartment in Brooklyn, New York. Minutes before midnight on November 5th, the police arrived at an apartment in Park Slope, Brooklyn, a part of the city known for its street-lined trees and historic brownstones. When they got to the apartment, they found several people living there, including a few construction workers working inside Adrian's building. Everyone inside the apartment was cooperative with the police. They all agreed to answer any questions, and some even let the police look through their belongings. One of the items the police looked through was a backpack. Inside the backpack, they found a pair of men's Reebok sneakers. When the police flipped the shoe over and looked at the bottom, they thought it had a similar tread and was a similar size shoe to the Reebok found inside Adrian's apartment. The backpack and pair of shoes belonged to 19-year-old Diego Pilco. The police learned that Diego, his brother, and one of his cousins all lived inside the apartment. They were living with their boss, the guy that owned the construction company that performed renovations at Adrian's apartment building in Manhattan. Originally from Ecuador, Diego Pilco was illegally living in the United States. He and his brother illegally immigrated to the U.S. after their parents paid people to get them across the border. Diego and his family owed over $13,000 to the people who brought them to the States. So in 2006, Diego and his brother were working for the construction company and sending money home to their parents in Ecuador to pay these people off. Once the police saw the pair of Reebok sneakers inside Diego's backpack, they immediately brought him down to the NYPD's 6th precinct for questioning. When they got to the police station, Diego told the police that he worked on the construction project in apartment 37, the one right below Adrian's, but he denied knowing anything about the murder. He told investigators that he had no idea who Adrian was and that he was never inside her apartment. based on the suspicion that the Reeboks found inside Diego's backpack might be the shoes found at the apartment, the police had enough to detain him for further questioning. The detectives began asking him about his whereabouts on November 1st, the day Adrian died. Initially, he admitted to working inside apartment 37 that morning. He told the investigators he wasn't at Adrian's apartment building long that day because he had a stomach ache. And not long after he got there, he left the building and went to a local pharmacy to get medicine. His boss was waiting outside when he got back to the apartment building, and his boss told him they needed his help with a different project at a different building. So according to Diego, he left Adrian's apartment building and went to work on another renovation project for the rest of the day. Detectives asked him if he had met Adrian while working in the apartment below hers. He said no. They also asked him if he had ever been inside her apartment. Once again, his answer was no. He denied having anything to do with her death, and he continued to claim he had no idea who she was. But the detectives weren't buying his story. One of the lead detectives assigned to the case noticed something about Diego as she questioned him. She noticed he was holding a prayer card in his hands as he was being questioned. This signaled to the detective that Diego was religious, so she decided to use this against him. The detective asked Diego if he had any children. He said no. He was only 19 years old and had just gotten to the United States. Then she asked if he had any young nieces or nephews. This question got his attention because he said yes. He said he had a few young nieces. One of them was around the same age as Adrian's daughter, Sophie. That's the exact moment when the lead detective knew she had him. She started to use Diego's religious spirit against him. She told him that if he had done anything bad to Adrian, his niece would pay. She tried appealing to both his religion and his love for his young nieces. After hearing that, Diego Pilco instantly cracked. He proceeded to make a full confession to Adrian Shelley's murder. Diego may have confessed, but he also had a story. In his first confession to the police, he told investigators that while he was working in the apartment below Adrian's, she came downstairs to complain about the noise. He said that Adrian was extremely angry and told him that she couldn't get her work done because of all the construction noise. He said she was screaming at him for several minutes. He also confessed to throwing a hammer in her direction. Worried that Adrian would call the police and he would be deported back to Ecuador, he said he followed her upstairs to her apartment. When they got to the door, Diego said Adrian turned around and slapped him across the face. He then punched her in the face, causing her to fall backward. And when she fell, she hit her head on a table. He said the fall was so bad that she was knocked unconscious when she hit her head. At that point, Diego said he thought Adrian was dead. Believing that she was dead, he made it look like a suicide. He took the bedsheet from the bed, tied the knot around Adrian's neck to make her death look like a suicide. The knot on the bedsheet was the same type of knot he used on his family's farm in Ecuador to tie up the pigs. NYPD detectives were happy they had a confession, but they weren't convinced about his story. Number one, they didn't believe that Adrian would go downstairs and scream at Diego as he said. They also didn't believe Adrian would slap him. Anyone who spent any amount of time around Adrian knew the kind of person she was. She wasn't the type of person to scream at someone or to threaten to call the police and deport them. Number two, were the injuries to Adrian's body. Dr. Bodden, the medical examiner who performed the second autopsy, found injuries and bruises all over her body, suggesting that she had been in a struggle shortly before her death. He also found defensive wounds on her hands, which indicate she was in a fight. Again, these injuries didn't match Diego's story. Finally, number 3 was the cause of death. The medical examiner determined that Adrian's cause of death was due to neck compression. The injuries to her neck suggested that she had been strangled before being hung from the bedsheet. Diego Pilco was arrested and charged with Adrian's murder, and in 2008, 2 years after her death, he stood trial. Diego changed his story at trial from the first one he told the police. This time, he said he returned to work after lunch when he saw Adrian walking toward her apartment. When he saw her, he decided that he was going to rob her. So he followed her from behind until they got to her apartment. He said he waited around the corner until she walked inside and closed the door. He waited in the hallway for a few minutes, then pulled on the front door to see if she left it unlocked. Once he realized she did and the door was unlocked, he said he went inside. He said he looked for her purse, but before he could find it, Adrian caught him. His plan to simply rob her went sideways. Once he realized he'd been caught, he knew he had to kill her. If he didn't, she would call the police and he would be deported. Instead of letting that happen, he tried choking her. But Adrian didn't go down easy. She fought back as she struggled to choke her, causing the defensive wounds on her hands and the bruising across her body. Finally, after several minutes of fighting, Adrian was left unconscious. Believing that she was dead, he decided to stage her death to make it look like a suicide. He grabbed the bedsheet and tied her to the top of the shower. But Adrian wasn't dead. Evidence collected from both of her autopsies suggested that she was very much alive when she was hung. If Diego hadn't decided to stage it to look like a suicide, Adrian might have survived. Diego Pilco eventually agreed to plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter. It wasn't the first-degree charge prosecutors and Adrian's family hoped for, but it was something. Following his guilty plea, Diego was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. And after he serves his 25-year sentence, he's scheduled to be deported back to Ecuador. At his sentencing hearing, Adrian's husband, Andy Ostroy, made a statement in part that read, quote, "Adrian was the kindest, warmest, most loving, generous person I knew. She was incredibly smart, funny, and talented. A bright light with an infectious laugh and huge smile that radiated her inner and outer beauty. She was my best friend and the person with whom I was supposed to grow old." End quote. He went on to kill his wife's killer, Diego Pilco, a quote, "nothing but a cold-blooded killer," end quote. After Diego Pilco's conviction, Andy Ostroy sued Bradford General Contractors, the company that hired Diego. His lawsuit alleged that Adrian would still be alive today had they not hired him. Andy also pursued lawsuits against the owners and management of the apartment building. This lawsuit alleged that the building's owners knowingly hired illegal immigrants to perform renovation work inside the building. In July 2011, the lawsuits were dismissed by a New York judge. The judge alleged that Andy hadn't established legal grounds to hold the contractor or the building's owners liable for Adrian's death. In the court's ruling, the judge didn't believe the contractor or the owners had any reason to think that Diego was a dangerous person capable of committing a crime like this. And simply because he was illegally living in the United States, the building's owners did nothing wrong. Shortly after Adrian's murder, Andy established the Adrian Shelley Foundation. It's a nonprofit organization that awards grants and scholarships to women in the film production industry, a cause that meant a lot to Adrian. As a female film producer and screenwriter herself, he knew this was the least he could do in her honor. Adrian's film Waitress was accepted into the 2007 Sundance Film Festival. Waitress went on to receive 5 film awards and received many other nominations. In August 2015, the musical Waitress debuted at the American Repertory Theater at Harvard University. The production closed in January 2020 after 33 previews and 1,500 performances. Years after her murder, the legacy of Adrian Shelley and her contributions to the film industry live on. If a second autopsy wasn't performed and new forensic evidence wasn't discovered, Adrian Shelley's murder may have gone down as a suicide, and her killer might have gotten away. But the discovery of several Reebok sneaker shoe impressions inside Adrian's bathroom led the police straight to her killer. To share your thoughts on the murder of Adrian Shelley, be sure to follow the show on Instagram and Facebook. To find out what I think about the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode where I share my personal thoughts and opinions about the case. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you don't miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, consider leaving us a positive review or tell friends and family about us. You can also help support the show through Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Please join me next week. We'll have a brand new story and a brand new case to talk about. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell Areola. For a small monthly contribution, you can help create new compelling cases for the show, help fund research, and assist with production and editing costs. For supporting the show, you'll become one of the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and snag exclusive show merchandise not available anywhere else. To learn about how you can support the show, head over to our Patreon page, patreon.com/forensictales, or simply click the support link in the show notes. You can also support the show by leaving a positive review or telling friends and family about us. Forensic Tales is a podcast made possible by our Patreon producers, Tony A., Nicole L., David B., Nicole G., Paula G., Christine B., Karen D., Sherry A., Elizabeth M., Michael D., Lisa S., and Nicola. If you'd like to become a producer of the show, head over to our Patreon page or send me an email at courtney@forensictales.com to find out how you can become involved. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.